We now come to the general debate on the Grenfell Tower Inquiry Phase 2 report. I call the Minister to move Secretary of State Angela Rayner.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I beg to move the motion. We will never forget the 72 lives that were lost as a result of that fateful night 7 years ago, nor the family, friends and neighbours who they left behind, some of whom are with us today in the gallery. I know that the whole House will join me in paying tribute to them. It is thanks to their awe-inspiring tenacity that we have got to where we are today, with Sir Martin Morbrick's report laying bare the truth of what happened. A day of truth that must now lead to a day of justice. They have waited too long for both. And justice denied is justice. Justice delayed is justice denied. There must be full accountability for the failures that led to the biggest loss of life in a residential fire since the Second World War. And the Metropolitan Police will continue to have our full support as they carry out their independent investigation. What we do know from Sir Martin Morbrick's report is that this tragedy was entirely avoidable, something that the bereaved survivors' immediate community will have to live with for the rest of their days. The knowledge that they and those dearest to them were so comprehensively failed. The report, Madam Deputy Speaker, makes for the most shocking of reading, shining a light on the systemic failures over decades. Everybody, those who manufactured and sold building products, the British state, the local council, the tenant management organisation, the London Fire Brigade, every single institution failed to recognise and protect those residents of Grenfell. Madam Deputy Speaker, reading the report, I was disgusted by the extent to which profits were put before people and the systemic dishonesty from some of the manufacturers, with catastrophic results. And the families weren't listened to. Everyone dismissed their concerns. The number one priority of any government is to keep its citizens safe. The Prime Minister apologised on behalf of the British state to the families on the day that the report was published for the catalogue of failures that led to the disaster. He committed to respond to all 58 of the inquiry's recommendations within 6 months. To the bereaved families, the survivors, those in the immediate community, and those of whom are with us here today, I reiterate the apology and that commitment. As the Prime Minister said, bigger change is needed, system change, reform of a system that is not delivering what it should, safe homes. But where we can start to make immediate change, I will not wait. The government will not wait. We are boosting the collective efforts to make homes safe, expecting leadership and action from industry, enforcing against landlords where necessary, and providing support so that leaseholders and residents can get on with their lives.
I commend the Deputy Prime Minister for her words that the Honourable Lady speaking in the words of us all in this House. We welcome those words, and we welcome the constructive way those words have been implemented today. In relation to accountability for those companies who are guilty, can the Deputy Prime Minister confirm that action will be taken? And secondly, can I ask the Deputy Prime Minister, when it comes to the findings of this report and the need to have everything in place, will the Deputy Prime Minister share that with the devolved administrations? Because there are lessons to be learned everywhere. Left and right of the Honourable Lady are two of our ministers who have conveyed this in the past. It'd be good to have it from the Honourable Lady on the record. Thank you so much.
Angela Rayner.
I thank my honourable friend for his intervention. He's absolutely right. I was speaking to families of those bereaved earlier, and I made sure I reiterated, whilst this chamber might not be full, I think on behalf of the whole House I speak to make sure that we continue to learn the lessons of Grenfell. And in regards to working with the devolved administrations and learning the lessons, absolutely. And we've seen this internationally, and some of the survivors and the families have told me this on other fires that have happened across Europe, that still, not just here but abroad, people are in that situation, and we need to make sure that we continue to keep our residents safe here. And Madam Deputy Speaker, I can announce today that we published our response to the Emergency Evacuation Information Sharing Plus consultation, which provides details of our new Residential Personal Emergency Evacuation Plans, PEEPs, policy to improve the fire, safety and evacuation of disabled and vulnerable residents in high-rise and high-risk residential buildings. Under the proposals, residents with disabilities or impairments will be entitled to an assessment to identify necessary equipment and adjustments to aid their fire and safety and evacuation. Fire and rescue services will also receive information on vulnerable residents in case they need to support their evacuation. We have committed to funding next year to begin this important work by supporting social housing providers to deliver the residential PEEPs for their tenants. Future years' funding, Madam Deputy Speaker, will be confirmed at the upcoming spending review. And statutory guidance has been updated to provide for evacuation alert systems in all new blocks of flats over 18 metres. This means that with our most recent move to provide sprinklers in all new care homes, strengthening protections for some of the most vulnerable. We have now addressed all of the recommendations made by the Grenfell Inquiry for Government in their Phase 1 report. The Prime Minister and I, and the rest of this government, are determined that industry will deliver real change. As government, our role is to ensure that that change is delivered. A generational shift in the safety and quality of housing for everyone in this country. We now need leadership from industry, Madam Deputy Speaker, to step up the pace on cultural change across the construction sector. But more crucially, a cultural shift that's about empowering people so that we put people and safety first and not profits. That's what needs to change. And it's in that spirit, inspired by the Grenfell community's incredible strength and tireless campaigning, that we will continue to push industry to deliver the necessary changes. And let me be crystal clear. We will be holding industry to account as closely as we need to. I know members across this House share my desire that this report be a catalyst for change.
I thank my right friend for giving way on the point of industry's responsibility. And it's right that both social housing tenants and leaseholders shouldn't be having to bear the burden of rectifying these buildings. The developers, the individual developers and the development industry has been financially held to account, at least to a significant degree. The one part of industry that's got completely away with it so far are the product manufacturers. So far, they've been asked to pay nothing towards rectifying the buildings, and they're responsible, as the Grenfell Inquiry showed, for a lot of the problems. So, can my right friend indicate what consideration is being given now to a scheme to make sure that product manufacturers pay their fair share of these costs?
Rayner. I thank my honourable friend for that intervention, and he's absolutely right, and we're continuing to see what measures we can take, and I've not taken nothing off the table and working with my officials to make sure that those that are responsible are the ones that pay and not the taxpayers. Madam Deputy Speaker, important progress has been made since 2017. Fire and rescue services are better trained and prepared for large-scale emergencies. Improvements have been made to local authority building enforcement. A poor culture among tenant housing associations is being tackled through regulation, but we must go further. If you speak to those who live in unsafe buildings, it doesn't feel like there has been progress. It doesn't feel like progress to them. They still feel trapped, still feel powerless in the face of a system that's not designed for them. So this government is acting.
I thank my right honourable friend for giving way, and she just has said many of my constituents are feeling very trapped. So I welcome the acceleration, but does she have any time frame, or will her department be working up a time frame for when this will have an impact on constituents, some of mine, who will be facing bankruptcy because of the challenges that they've been facing? And I should declare for the record, Madam Deputy Speaker, that I am a leaseholder.
Angela Rayner.
I thank my honourable friend. The absolute deadline we've put forward as part of our remediation acceleration plan is 2029, but we want to go much further. And myself and the Minister has met with developers and others, and we continue to push really hard on this. It's been one of our number one focus. 7 years on... yes, sure.
For giving away, and I commend her for the way she's introduced this. But there's another group of people that I don't think have been properly considered that yet. And those are those people who have lost their property, could remortgage their property, couldn't sell it at the market rate because they had cladding issues and problems. My constituent Crawford Wilson invested his life savings into a property, unaware at the time that this had cladding problems. This meant he couldn't secure a remortgage and he couldn't sell the property for anything like the market value. It was finally repossessed and he lost hundreds of thousands of pounds as a result. What advice could the Deputy Prime Minister offer my constituent, and what is she going to do to try and ensure that that is put right?
Rayner.
I thank the honourable member for that intervention, and it just shows really the damage that these organisations, those that cladded these buildings, the systemic failures, how that's had a real impact. And that is why, since we were elected in July, my number one focus has been on trying to make sure that these buildings are safe and the remediation happens. 7 years on is far too long, Madam Deputy Speaker, for us to still be in this position where those buildings still are unsafe. And I'll come on to some of the issues that we're trying to resolve, including those that are paying exorbitant insurance rates at this moment in time as well. 7 years on from the Grenfell Tower tragedy, we still have thousands of people living in homes across this country with unsafe cladding. The toll this has placed on thousands of people is, I know, intolerable. The financial worries, the impact on mental health, the lives that have been put on hold, people unable to plan their futures, the fears of just not going to sleep in case something happens in the night, as it did in June 2017. This is a scandal. It permeates every aspect of lives of those who live in unsafe buildings, buildings that have been bought or rented in good faith. This is completely unacceptable. People must be and must feel safe in their homes. So we are taking a major step towards this with the statement laid in the House today. Our remediation acceleration plan sets out our ambitious measures to fix buildings faster, identify those still at risk and ensure that residents are supported through the remediation process. We are committed to getting homes fixed faster. Through the remediation acceleration plan, we aim to do that by 2029 at the latest on all residential buildings 18 metres and over with unsafe cladding in a government-funded scheme that will be remediated. And by the end of 2029, every residential building 11 metres and over with unsafe cladding will either be remediated or have a date of completion, or the landlord will be liable for severe penalties. We will introduce new legal obligations on landlords to remediate unsafe cladding with severe penalties, including sanctions for inaction. We are backing this up with new funding and new guidance for regulators to drive remediation forward. We have a plan to tackle the remediation needed in the social sector to support social landlords to ensure their stock is safe. The Building Safety Levy and developers repaying government funds will ensure that the cost of fixing these buildings, Madam Deputy Speaker, will not fall on the taxpayer. And above all, we will take measures to protect residents and leaseholders during remediation. They are the innocent parties in this. This is our plan, and my honourable friend sat beside me today will be able to share more details as part of this debate. Developers must pay their part in accelerating remediation. They have already committed to fix or pay to fix unsafe buildings at an estimated cost of more than £3.4 billion, but progress, Madam Deputy Speaker, has been too slow. Works have started in fewer than half of the developer buildings known to be unsafe. That's why we have agreed a new joint plan with developers to accelerate mediation and improve the experience of residents, which we are publishing today. For the first time, developers are committing to achieve ambitious stretch targets to assess all their buildings by July 2025 and to start or complete remedial works on all their unsafe buildings by July 2027. Madam Deputy Speaker, to meet these stretch targets, developers will need to more than double the pace at which they've been assessing buildings and starting remediation work so far this year. Already more than 25 developers have signed up to the plan, bringing more than 95% of buildings that developers need to remediate into scope. That's encouraging. We are often reminded about just how crucial decisive action to replace unsafe cladding is. Just last week, a fire at the Quadrangle building in Greater Manchester, a building that was remediated in 2021 through the ACM Private Sector Cladding Remediation Fund, thankfully did not turn into an emergency situation. If the building had not been remediated, this situation could have been much more serious. To keep residents safe in their homes until remediation work has been carried out, we are extending the Waking Watch Replacement Fund until the spring of 2026. I will confirm long-term plans at the end of the next spending review. Too many leaseholders in buildings that need remediation face unaffordable insurance premiums, and this cannot continue. I can confirm from today we will start working with insurers to consider whether, for the duration of the remediation programmes, government might support industry to reduce fire-related liabilities, to reduce the high insurance bills that leaseholders are facing. As part of our commitment to minimising unfair costs to leaseholders, I can also announce that we are tackling the problem of unfair charges that managing buildings insurance have been doing, and today we've launched a consultation on this. I want the message to go out loud and clear that we expect industry, those who build and maintain our homes, to lead the way in creating a culture that puts safety of residents first. Money is available to make buildings safe, but incredibly, some landlords are still failing to act. Through their inaction, they are preventing homes from being made safe. It's outstandingly neglectful and a dereliction of responsibility. We will not stand for this any longer.
I'm grateful to the Secretary of State for giving way. She may be aware that in my constituency we have the highest number of high-rise buildings in the entire country. And one thing that my constituents would want reassurance on is, will the scope of penalties and sanctions include, for those landlords that do not comply and do not follow the remediation acceleration plan, the ability to not expand their portfolios and continue to build in the manner that they are, thus ensuring accountability and ensuring that those harms that they have enacted are not reproduced.
Rayner.
I thank my honourable friend for that intervention, and I've been very clear with developers that why would somebody want to purchase a home from a developer who they see as not doing action on remediation, and that's why we've got many of them round the table to sign up to this acceleration plan, because I do believe that they want to remediate this problem, and it's been too long and things need to change, and there will be consequences for landlords for failing to act. We're clear on that. With the support of Parliament, we will put legislation in place to ensure that they do. The London Borough of Tower Hamlets recently became the first local authority in England to successfully obtain a remediation order, and I expect, Madam Deputy Speaker, to see many more of these in the future. And to ensure that regulators can act, we will be providing £33 million next financial year to local authorities, fire and rescue authorities and building safety regulators so that they can tackle hundreds of cases per year. We will also provide a further £5 million to the Recovery Strategy Unit to increase their capacity to act. And let me be clear, this includes, where necessary, pursuing landlords in the courts. Absolutely. Industry must act now to fix the thousands of unsafe buildings that must be made safe. They must take seriously their obligations to remediate buildings and design, construct and maintain buildings safely. If you own an unsafe building, If you are a landlord that is not fixing that building, this government will make sure that you do, and we will propose legislation to ensure it. There can be no more delay, no more excuses and no more obstructions. Yeah. To be the change that this government and the Grenfell Inquiry demands, we must build effective services that command public trust and confidence and that are fit for the 21st century. Those who flout their responsibilities will have nowhere to hide. We will take direct action to hold those that are failing to meet their obligations to account. It's why we've committed to a system-wide reform of the construction products regulatory regime and why we'll consult on robust sanctions, penalties and liabilities against manufacturers. And I can update the House that we have made good on our pledge to write to organisations identified by the inquiry for their part in this tragedy. Organisations will hold different levels of responsibility, but I can announce that we will publish guidance early next year to support the first set of decisions that will stop the most appalling companies from being awarded government contracts. But, Madam Deputy Speaker, as I have already said, the system itself needs reform. Statutory guidance on building regulations covering fire safety and building design is now subject to continuous review by the Building Safety Regulator. But I want to go further, and so I can announce today that I've asked the regulator to undertake a fundamental review of the building safety regulations guidance is produced, updated and communicated to the construction industry, because we must get this right.
Giving way once again, it's back to this issue of the product manufacturers, and I'm really pleased to hear what she says about government contracts for the worst offenders. Can she also consider giving guidance to local authorities and other public bodies like the NHS to make sure that they also are aware of the need not to award contracts to these particular companies?
Yes, I'm happy to look at that issue. I think the spirit in which I'm trying to get across is that we have to have a cultural shift, and therefore everyone has to play their part in making sure that happens, and anything this government can do to make that happen, I'm willing to look at as part of this.
Would the Secretary of State weigh on that?
Yeah.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And I'm very grateful to the Secretary of State, and may I say that I think she's making an excellent speech, and I wholeheartedly welcome the measures she's announced today. In my constituency, one of the challenges we've had is that, sadly, there have been some poor examples of workmanship or workpersonship, and there have been some sloppy pieces of building which have opened up residents to fire risk. Things like poorly built compartmentalisation, so fire safety walls not built properly, gaps, use of wood where wood shouldn't have been used, that sort of risk. Would she perhaps also be able to ask her officials to look into these types of matters and for better guidance to be provided?
I think my honourable friend makes a very important point, and cladding is one element of what many tenants face with buildings that are unsafe, and we're already looking at how we can strengthen to make sure that action is taken. And I know some local authorities have already started to take enforcement action, and I've pushed really hard to make sure that we continue to do that, because if a building's unsafe, people shouldn't have to live in it, and it should be dealt with as quickly as possible. Madam Deputy Speaker, we are bringing local authority leaders and ministers together through the new Leaders Council to work through these issues, and I thank them all for their engagement today, including our mayors. The Resilience Review announced in July will continue to bring together the devolved governments, local leaders and experts to consider where things are working well and where there could be improvements to ensure that the UK is prepared for the risks we face. And we must work with those in industry to ensure that buildings are safe, to raise professional standards and create a culture that puts the safety of residents first. Fire and rescue services need to do more to develop high-quality leadership and support learning and professional excellence, and we are carefully considering the inquiry's recommendation to establish a College of Fire and Rescue. We expect all firefighters to have access to the vital education and training they need to save lives and to be the best that they can be. Culture and integrity in fire and rescue services is vital. Poor culture, a lack of integrity and bad practice can risk public safety. As highlighted by the Grenfell Inquiry, this is unacceptable and culture change must begin immediately. Madam Deputy Speaker, our response to the Grenfell report must be a watershed moment, not just for the safety and quality, but for a new vision of housing that gives every resident a voice and the respect that they deserve. A change in culture that truly empowers people. As I said earlier, the failure to do this with the Grenfell residents, who repeatedly raised concerns and were repeatedly ignored, stands out starkly. Everyone deserves a warm, decent home. They also have the right to be treated with dignity and have access to redress when things go wrong. This includes the millions of people living in social housing, which is why we have introduced a stronger set of consumer standards that applies to all registered social landlords. Routine inspections of large landlords have already started, and the regulator of social housing has published the first set of judgments. Many landlords must do more to improve the quality of their buildings and communicate better with their tenants. And when it comes to quality and tackling unacceptable housing conditions, we'll legislate to introduce Arab's law in the social rented sector as soon as possible, setting a requirement for landlords to investigate and repair serious hazards with specific timeframes. And Madam Deputy Speaker, we will also extend Arab's law to the private rented sector through the Renters' Rights Bill. We will also bring forward regulations to set standards for the competence and conduct of staff in the sector and enable residents to request information about their landlords through new access requirements that will apply to housing associations. And we will monitor the new regime and its effectiveness closely. And while we're doing more to raise the bar for social landlords, we're also empowering tenants and giving them a seat at the table. Relaunching our communications campaign on how people can raise complaints and extending this work so that all residents know their rights and can hold their landlords to account. And hearing firsthand what matters most to social tenants this week, my honourable friend, the Minister of State for Housing, will join our relaunched social housing residents panel. Changing the culture in our social housing system will take time, but these are important first steps. Madam Deputy Speaker, in conclusion, the reforms I've set out here today are about much more than new regulation and legislation. The Grenfell inquiry made it clear that these alone are not enough. Nothing less than a shift in culture that puts people and safety first, not profits first, will do if we are to turn the page on the shocking failures exposed by the Grenfell report. Accelerating the pace of the remediation and empowering tenants are important steps in the right direction. Because no matter who you are or where you live, a good life starts with a safe, secure, decent home and a strong community. We owe it to the Grenfell community and everything they stand for and have fought for to make sure that everyone can count on this. The Grenfell community, we will continue to work with you to build a fitting and lasting memorial. This government will support you now and always, and in memory of the loved ones they lost so tragically. Amen.
Shadow Secretary of State Kevin Hollinrake. Apologies. The question is that. Oh, I'm sorry.
Hi.
The question is as on the order paper. Shadow Secretary of State Kevin Hollinrake.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. The Grenfell Tower fire was an unthinkable tragedy that claimed 72 lives. It is one of the few moments in life where we all remember exactly where we were when it happened. Our thoughts are with those who lost loved ones, the survivors who endured unimaginable trauma, and all those who were affected by that devastating night. The state failed them. In its duty to protect, we must ensure that such failures are never repeated. Can I first say to the Right Honourable Lady, the Secretary of State, that we will work collaboratively with her and the wider government in the interests of everyone directly and indirectly affected by this tragedy. And I very much welcome today's announcement about the acceleration of remediation. Following the tragedy, the Conservative government took decisive action to uncover the truth, initiating a public inquiry to learn the lessons and implement changes to prevent such a tragedy from ever happening again. She may remember we served briefly together on the Housing, Communities and Local Government Select Committee. That committee, under the extremely capable leadership of the Right Honourable Gentleman, the member for Sheffield South East, led much of the thinking and debate following the tragedy. We successfully campaigned for a banning of combustible materials on the outside of new buildings over 18 metres and for a government remediation fund for existing buildings. I pay tribute to my honourable friend, the member for Richmond and Northallerton, who was the first to properly grasp this nettle as Chief Secretary of the Treasury, Chancellor and Prime Minister. Over £5.1 billion has since been allocated for building remediation, and we have acted to strengthen regulations and implement the recommendations from the inquiry's Phase 1 report. I can also pay tribute to her predecessor, the former member for Surrey Heath, for the work he did in this area, not least the establishment of the Building Safety Levy, which much of the funds will flow from that particular source. However, the publication of the Phase 2 report in September 2024 has revealed the scale of failures that occurred over decades and across multiple sectors, making it clear that much more remains to be done, as the Right Honourable Lady sets out. Even those of us who have followed the inquiry closely find the report truly shocking to read. The Phase 2 report, chaired by the Right Honourable Sir Martin Moore-Bick and supported by panel members Ali Iqbal, OBE and Thuria Estefan, make 58 recommendations to improve fire safety and address systematic issues within the construction industry. Crucially, the report concluded that Grenfell Tower fire was the result of decades of failures by government, regulatory bodies and the construction industry to act on the known dangers of using combustible materials in high-rise buildings. One of the most alarming findings was the role of systemic dishonesty in the construction industry. Companies engaged in deliberate and sustained strategies to manipulate safety testing processes, misrepresent test data and mislead the market. For instance, the insulation product Celotex RS5000 used on Grenfell Tower was found to have been sold using manipulated test results, incredibly, with the building research establishments complicit in these practices. Very happy, of course, to give word to
Safety, and I thank him for his comments about the work the Select Committee did. Come back to this issue of product safety and product testing. What the Hackett report found out, as well as the Select Committee, was the extent to which product manufacturers are going round from one testing place to another till they found one that agreed their product was safe. But very often they fail, but those failures were never in the public domain. So do you think now maybe there ought to be a change of process, so where a product fails in one testing place, that is made publicly known?
I agree with him, as I did on much of our work on the Select Committee, and I see one of the recommendations from Martin Moore-Bick was to do exactly that all test results should be published. And I think, to be clear, not just the ones that support the safety of the product. All tests should be published, and I think that would go a long way to making sure that the true safety of these products is established. The findings of the BRE highlights a shocking betrayal of trust and a callous disregard for public safety driven by financial gain. The report also identified severe leadership and management failings within London Fire Brigade. It described a chronic lack of effective management, an undue focus on processes and a complacency among senior officers regarding the brigade's operational efficiency. These weaknesses hindered the brigade's ability to respond effectively to the crisis and underscored the need for systemic reform and improved leadership in fire services. To address these failings, the Phase 2 report made far-reaching recommendations, including the establishment of a single construction regulator, centralising fire safety responsibilities under one Secretary of State to end fragmentation across government departments, regular updates to approved document B to keep fire safety regulations current, the creation of a chief construction advisor and a college of fire and rescue to ensure high standards in fire safety training and practices. We fully support these recommendations and urge the Government to implement them swiftly and effectively. We will scrutinise, of course, their progress to ensure that necessary reforms are delivered without delay. On the remediation efforts, some have questioned the pace of this, which I think the Right Honourable Lady is right to do. I must emphasise that remediation efforts prioritise the highest risk buildings, and by July 2024, 98% of high-rise buildings with the most dangerous Grenfell-style ACM cladding had either completed or started work. Of the remaining buildings, enforcement action is being taken against non-compliant owners. The complexity of these buildings and legal disputes over responsibility have caused delays. Nevertheless, all building owners must step up, take responsibility and act swiftly to address these issues or face the consequences of their inaction. It's also important to note that the building regulations regime was established under the Building Act 1984, and reforms of the fire safety order were introduced by other governments in previous decades, as the Right Honourable Lady acknowledges. From 2010, the coalition government sought to remove unnecessary bureaucracy, but the fire safety and building safety were explicitly excluded from these reviews. The inquiry itself acknowledged that key safety regulations, including the Regulatory Reform Fire Safety Order of 2005, were excluded from deregulation initiatives. Under our leadership, safety was never treated as red tape. But nevertheless, as the report confirms, mistakes were made by ministers and officials under our watch. I think the frequency of changes under governments of different political stripes, frequency of changes to housing ministers and housing secretaries would not have helped either. And I hope that's a lesson Parliament may learn for the future. Since 2017, Conservatives in government led comprehensive reforms of building compliance and fire safety. Measures introduced include the Fire Safety Act 2021 and the Building Safety Act 2022, which created a building safety regulator to oversee stricter compliance standards. Yes, I'm very happy to give way to the Chair.
Madam Deputy Speaker, I thank the Honourable Gentleman for giving way. One of the issues that arose at an early stage, about a year in from the tragedy at Grenfell, was that there was a need for fire safety surveyors. These people are experts. They take about 3 years to train. In retrospect, looking back, as he's been on this, followed this matter, would he not think that there's a lesson for government of any colour in future to look at those issues at an early stage, because we still are short of those people now in 2024?
Yes, I agree with you. Mistakes were made, there's no doubt about it. And I think, as the Phase 2 report recommends, there should be greater oversight in terms of regulation of people that proclaim themselves to be experts in these fields. So I agree with the points that she raises. Accountability must remain a cornerstone of our response. Those who knowingly cut corners on safety to maximise profits must face justice. We call on the Metropolitan Police and the Crown Prosecution Service to pursue criminal charges against those responsible, be it through deliberate act, a willingness to look the other way, or gross incompetence. Companies implicated in such wrongdoing should not receive future public contracts. Let us be clear, this was not the responsibility of any single government, minister or official, but as the report sets out in its open paragraphs, failures occurred over decades involving administrations of all political colours. We must approach these difficult questions with the honesty and determination they deserve, ensuring that we learn the lessons of the past to protect lives in the future. Whilst we have made significant progress, we know that this journey is far from over. While we look to the future, we must also acknowledge the hard questions raised by this report about past governance. These failures occurred over decades involving administrations led by Labour, the Coalition and Conservative governments. This was a systemic failure that requires an open and honest response. Our party's record demonstrates our commitment to making things right. We took swift action after the tragedy to establish the public inquiry, launch the independent review of building regulations and fire safety, and allocate significant resources to remove unsafe cladding from high-risk buildings. The Fire Safety Act 2021 implemented recommendations from Phase 1 of the Grenfell inquiry, and the Building Safety Act 2022 overhauled existing regulations, setting up the Building Safety Regulator to oversee stringent compliance measures. Yes, of course, very happy to give way.
I thank the Honourable Member for giving way. Bournemouth East constituents like Katie in Queen's Park and Chalminster have been in touch, horrified about the Grenfell Tower tragedy and desperate for a turning point. Would he agree with me that we need to have that turning point? We need justice for those who were let down by the last government? And would he also agree with me that we need to get rid of the social housing stigma, which has made so many people in social housing feel like they live in shame?
There are so many lessons to learn. I hope I'll learn to cost a house, because the report is very clear, the fact that there's been fairly by governments of all stripes over the years, both in terms of building safety and in terms of social housing. So the social housing regulator and the new regulatory regime over fire safety is hugely important. We do turn that page. But I don't think we'll win back the trust of the people affected by this scandal and affected by, in other areas, that are affected by the cladding scandal, until we actually have made that progress, completed a remediation and put in place a regime that is seen to be working and brings about that cultural change that the Right Honourable Lady referred to. I think those are hugely important we make that progress. The actions we have taken have made strides towards addressing safety concerns, but we do recognise that more is needed. I welcome the Labour Government's pledge to respond to all 58 recommendations within 6 months and to provide annual progress updates to Parliament. This is a critical moment for accountability and reform, and we stand ready to support all proportionate and necessary measures to protect public safety. Could I finish by asking the Right Honourable Lady whether she agrees with the recommendation of a single construction regulator with one Secretary of State holding end-to-end responsibility, and will that be her? Does she also agree to the point raised by the Right Honourable Gentleman, the member for Sheffield South East, about product manufacturers also being held responsible for remediation costs? It is her stated policy to continue the use of the CE marking for construction products in the UK, but these standards were set in 2015, 3 years prior to the post-Grenfell standards revision in the UK. How will she make sure that all products sold in the UK meet the UK post-2018 standard? This is an issue that has been addressed and raised on the floor of the House by my right honourable friend next to me on the front benches, shadow front benches. I have recently met with campaigners, including Steve Day, who raises the case of the 1.7 million leaseholders who do not currently qualify for the Building Safety Act protections and still suffer from higher insurance premiums, mortgage rates and an inability to sell their homes. Will she meet with him and others to see what additional measures need to be taken? Is she able to share with the House when announcements will be made on the future of the site in terms of the future memorial of the site, and indeed the renovation of properties in the Grenfell community, where that can be accelerated and where we can get a target date for that being completed? Accountability must be at the heart of this response, and those who knowingly cut corners on building safety must face justice. Madam Deputy Speaker, Grenfell was a tragedy of unprecedented scale, but it also must serve as a turning point. We owe it to those who lost their lives, to the survivors and to the public to ensure that their legacy is one of justice, reform and safety. Let us move forward with determination to build a safer future for all.
Joe Powell.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. It's now over 7.5 years since 72 people lost their lives at Grenfell Tower in my constituency in North Kensington. a greater loss of life than any terrorist attack in London's history. 7.5 years of no justice, 7.5 years of no meaningful change. A tragedy that was entirely preventable, entirely foreseen, and to our shame as a country, as the recent fire in Dagenham showed, could happen again today. Yep. As the Grenfell Inquiry sets out, it occurred because individuals and organisations were systematically dishonest, put profit before lives, and were part of a system and a culture that too often denies agency and power to those living in social housing in this country. And I want to pay tribute to the next of kin, bereaved survivors in our community, many of whom have joined us here today, for their resilience and strength in continuing to fight for truth, justice and change. I know with each hearing, each story, each government announcement, each new promise of change, you're forced to relive the horrific events of that night. And I know today will be painful too. Your voices must remain at the heart of this government's response and to all future decisions about Grenfell. And I hope I speak for the whole House when I say to you that justice will only truly be served when there are criminal prosecutions and those responsible pay the price. I welcome, of course, the Prime Minister's apology on September 4th on behalf of the British state, and I want to thank Sir Martin Morbick and the whole inquiry team. The report is an important step to uncovering the truth of what happened that night, who was responsible, and what must be done to ensure such a tragedy is never repeated. But the path to justice is long, and we are far from the end. In recent meetings with the Courts Minister and the Metropolitan Police, I've been clear that our community is watching and waiting, and I urge all involved to remain focused on expediting the process as much as possible. And I fully understand the frustration that has taken this long. On June the 24th, 2017, then Ministers Alok Sharma and Nick Hurd wrote to bereaved families. They said, and I quote, "The public inquiry will not delay the conclusion of the police inquiry, and that if any criminal proceedings result from these investigations, we would not expect them to be delayed by the establishment of a public inquiry." That has clearly not come to pass. Justice has been delayed, but it must not be denied. And while we wait for the police and the CPS to complete their work, there are actions that must be taken now. Companies identified in the report, such as Arconic, Ryden, Kingspan and Celotex, must be excluded from public contracts while criminal investigations are ongoing. And I thank the Deputy Prime Minister for her commitment to this, and I agree with my right honourable friend from Sheffield South East that local authorities across the country should be encouraged to follow suit. But justice, Madam Deputy Speaker, is about more than contracts and criminal charges, and it goes beyond Grenfell. Across the country, up to 1 million people are still stuck in unsafe buildings, victims of the building safety crisis. The National Audit Office has just reported that on current trends, it will take until at least 2037 before the last unsafe building is remediated at a cost of £16.6 billion. So I absolutely welcome the government's announcement today that it will speed up the remediation work and that developers will be forced to double the pace of fixing the crisis, and that building owners who sit on their hands will be subject to severe penalties. And this is right, because while residents wait, they also pay the cost. In a block of flats in Earls Court, just 2 miles south of Grenfell, a recent fire inspection found flammable rendering. The insurance premium has gone up from £15,000 a year to £375,000 a year, meaning an extra £400 a month in service charges for leaseholders. So while leaseholders face this increasing cost of living crisis and the fear of living in buildings that are unsafe, I do believe the insurance industry has so far failed to tackle the problem. The Association of British Insurers committed to bring down costs, but the experience of my constituents shows it is not working. So I'm delighted that the government has committed to work with insurers to urgently consider how bills can be reduced during remediation programmes, and it cannot come soon enough. I know honourable members from across this House will have their own horror stories. Leaseholders who can't sell, can't move on with their lives, are caught in the middle between freeholders, developers, managing agents and all levels of government. So my test of this government's plan and whether it will be deemed a success is whether it brings this merry-go-round of buck passing to an end. I know the government is also considering its formal response to the inquiry, including ending the chaotic and fragmented regulatory system. Accountability for building regulations should be streamlined under a single Secretary of State. We need one regulator, a high-quality, well-resourced public body reporting directly to that Secretary of State. And we need robust product regulation. Currently, only a third of construction products are regulated. Instead, all construction products should be subject to regulation to ensure safety and public trust. And of course, this inquiry is just one of many recent high-profile public inquiries into state injustices, from Hillsborough to the Post Office, Windrush, infected blood and LGBT veterans. And I welcome the government's resolve to righting the wrongs of the past and tackling these injustices which the previous government largely had failed to budget for. Time and again, we've seen a pattern of inaction. Too many life-saving recommendations from public inquiries and inquests have been ignored by corporate bodies and government departments. And this failure to act has had fatal consequences. Had the coroner's recommendations following the Lakanal House fire, which claimed 6 lives, been implemented, the Grenfell tragedy would likely have been prevented. And the previous government dragged their feet on implementing personal emergency evacuation plans for disabled people from Phase 1. So I welcome the government's announcement today on the next steps to protect disabled tenants. And it is examples like this, Madam Deputy Speaker, that have convinced me that we must consider an independent oversight body, answerable to Parliament, to track the implementation of inquiry recommendations and prevent avoidable deaths. And I, of course, also welcome the commitment to passing the Hillsborough Law duty of candour to ensure public authorities and officials act in the public interest with openness, honesty and transparency about their actions, decisions and failings. And nowhere is the need for candour and oversight more evident than with the Royal Borough of Kensington and Chelsea, which failed residents in years leading up to the Grenfell fire, on the night of the tragedy and in its aftermath. The inquiry determined that RBKC, and I quote, bears considerable responsibility for the dangerous condition of the building, highlighted a persistent indifference to fire safety, and found that their response was muddled, slow, indecisive and piecemeal, with RBKC ill-equipped to deal with a serious emergency, exposing a complete failure to protect and serve the community it was entrusted to care for. And even today, many North Kensington residents still rely on community groups for essential support and services. In stark contrast to the failures of RBKC, it was the community that acted decisively and heroically on the night of the fire and in its immediate aftermath. And I am proud of how our community responded to the fire and continues to support residents across North Kensington. But, Madam Deputy Speaker, this is not just about one council. It's about a culture of neglect and disrespect that impacts millions of people living in social housing across the country. 60% of my casework in Kensington and Bayswater relates to slow repairs, damp, mould, overcrowding and poor communication from landlords. On Saturday, I visited a council estate close to Grenfell and spoke with many residents. A woman who's been in temporary accommodation for 19 years out of the borough and had to chase relentlessly to get her moved back home. A resident with an extractor fan that's been broken for years despite multiple surveyors coming to assess the job.
Would my friend give way on that point?
I would, yeah.
I thank him for making such a powerful speech on behalf of his constituents. What he's described there can reflect all our inboxes. Does he agree that actually to address residents, tenants and leaseholders' concerns in a timely manner with good customer care doesn't cost any money?
I thank my honourable friend for that intervention, and she's absolutely right. In fact, the wasted resources in time, in precious resources that housing associations and councils have, in people taking time off work and disrupting their lives to deal with this inefficiency in repairs is something we have to fix. And I'm really hopeful that incoming legislation will, for example, on Awab's law, will help with that. And as I said, this case study from just Saturday is a good example. My constituent forced to open the windows to prevent mould coming into her home means she's paying thousands in extra energy bills over the past few years while she waits for the council to fix it. And on the Lancaster West estate itself, where Grenfell is located, there are concerns that the promise from all levels of government for a modern 21st century social housing estate will not be fulfilled. So it's essential that RBKC, residents and ministers agree a plan to complete the refurbishment with transparency and accountability on budgets and timelines, because those residents have been living on a building site for far too long. And it's not enough just to talk about change. It is until the tenants of RBKC and the housing associations in my constituency are treated with respect and have access to the rights they are entitled to, then they will rightly lack trust in the institutions that are meant to serve them. Just last week, the regulator found one of our major housing associations, Notting Hill Genesis, to be non-compliant after an inspection revealed governance failings and poor health and safety outcomes for tenants. But, Madam Deputy Speaker, I don't want to just criticise. I want to help RBKC and our housing associations to find solutions. In the new year, we'll be launching a new campaign on social housing quality in Kensington and Bayswater, because I want our community to be a trailblazer on how to implement Awab's law on damp and mould, how to enforce the new decent home standard, how to break people out of the doom cycle of endless emails, phone calls, missed appointments and subcontractors to get even simple repairs done. And if we can't get it right in Kensington and Bayswater, given Grenfell, given our amazing community organisations, and given we're on the front line of the nation's housing crisis, then what hope does the rest of the country have? And central to this campaign will be the voice of tenants. So I want to extend an open invitation to anyone who can help to join our campaign and make a practical difference for the community. Madam Deputy Speaker, it's now been over 7 years since the bereaved survivors and local community endured a tragedy that changed their lives forever. I will continue to advocate in this place for truth, justice and lasting change, and for Grenfell bereaved and survivors to be heard. Their dignity and resilience have held up a mirror to us as a nation, forcing us to confront a fundamental question. Do we truly give everyone an equal voice in how this country is run? The opportunity is for this government, a mission-led government, to focus on service and give people a real say in decisions that affect them. We cannot afford to continue with nearly 1 million people sleeping in unsafe buildings. We cannot afford another Grenfell Tower. So true justice means criminal charges for those responsible. It means a complete culture change with respect for every tenant. And it means every child in this country growing up in a safe and decent home. That must be the legacy of Grenfell.
Liberal Democrat spokesperson Gideon Amos.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Like members across this House, Liberal Democrats on these benches stand firmly with the many bereaved, their immediate community of family, friends and neighbours as they mourn the 72, including children, who tragically lost their lives in June 2017. In this debate, surely one thing matters more than anything, that is that their memory must be respected. But as Sir Martin Morbick's Phase 2 report on the underlying cause of the fire graphically lays bare, they were cruelly let down by the systems, companies, governments, government bodies which should have protected them. We welcome the government's commitment to address all the recommendations in the report and the Prime Minister's promise in response to Phase 2 report to take the necessary steps to speed up the rate at which unsafe cladding is removed from buildings and to ensure that tenants and their leaseholders can never again be ignored. But the National Audit Office have said that the pace of remediation work is behind where it should be. They've called for the onus to be placed on developers to pay for the work, whilst MHCLG figures show that works have begun in 44% of buildings with unsafe cladding. 7 years on, it's deeply worrying that 66% are waiting, and that there are still thousands of people in the UK living in buildings with dangerous cladding. And therefore, I welcome the government's announcements about accelerating progress. As the National Housing Federation has pointed out, 90% of government funding for this work so far has been received by private building owners, but many have passed the costs of remediation work onto tenants and leaseholders, putting many, quite unfairly, in serious financial peril. Leaseholders have struggled under the cladding crisis, buying properties they believed met safety standards, which they realise now do not, and suffering from huge increases in insurance premiums, as we've heard. We are calling, therefore, for the removal of all such dangerous cladding as soon as possible, without tenants and leaseholders, and I would say including non-qualifying leaseholders, having to pay. After all, they place their trust in the private companies and regulatory bodies that let them down. They should not have to pay a penny towards it. But as has been said by the Honourable Member for Sheffield South, product manufacturers surely should be paying. This whole picture points to the need to create a legally enforceable order to remediate premises so that they are safe on pain of criminal sanction. And again, I welcome what the Deputy Prime Minister had to say on that a few moments ago. It's time, 7 years on from this scandal, for justice for both the victims and for all those living with potentially unsafe cladding. The inquiry report clearly establishes lessons to be learned for every authority in the land. The pathway to disaster, as Sir Martin called it, is chilling. It's incumbent on us all here in this House and everyone connected with the built environment and with fire safety to ensure that change happens and to take forward the recommendations of his report, not least my own professions, and as an architect and town planner, I refer the House to my register of interests. The Architects Registration Board, working with the Royal Institute of British Architects, now has a duty under the Building Safety Act and monitoring and training and development of architects to complete throughout their careers. And we welcome the fact that now it is now mandatory for all architects this year to complete training in fire safety. But one factor, Madam Deputy Speaker, comes through that had a devastating effect on the lives of so many. The promotion of the gaining of commercial advantage at the expense of building and fire safety in the fateful chain of events that led to the fire in 2017. The Building Research Establishment, originally a public body but privatised in the 90s, in its testing of dangerous cladding, the inquiry says exhibited a desire to accommodate existing customers and to retain its status within the industry at the expense of maintaining the rigour of its processes and considerations of public safety. The supplier companies, the inquiry report says, I quote, engaged in deliberate and sustained strategies to manipulate the testing processes, misrepresent test data, and mislead the market. In the case of the principal installation product used on Grenfell Tower, Celotex RS5000, the Building Research Establishment was complicit in that strategy. Building inspectors too, since their privatisation in the 1980s, a move with which even the most commercially minded partners at the practice I worked in a few years later strongly disagreed, have also faltered as a result of commercial pressures, with the resulting unacceptable blurring of responsibilities in our view. Sir Martin's report concludes that the privatised building inspectors at NHBC, and I quote, failed to ensure that its building control function remained essentially regulatory and was free of commercial pressures. It was unwilling to upset its customers. We have concluded, the report goes on, of Sir Martin, that the conflict between the regulatory function of building control and the pressures of commercial interests prevents a system of that kind from effectively serving the public interest. It's also clear that NHBC practices also expose what remains of local authority building control to similarly unscrupulous competition, and has driven down standards there too as a result.
Will you give way?
I will give way.
I thank him for his very powerful speech. Does he agree that a lot of the problems have also arisen from the underfunding and the poor funding of local authorities where building control services have been severely undermined?
I very much agree with my honourable friend, the member for Bath, and what is clear from my time in the profession is that as local authority building control has been exposed to private competition with which it is very difficult to compete. It's led to a race to the bottom. In fact, don't take my words for it. Expert witness Professor Luke Bisbee summed it up. A culture shift in building control had gradually occurred from one of building control actors policing developers to one of them working with clients under commercial duress. This resulted in a race to the bottom. Liberal Democrats therefore strongly support the recommendation that the government considers whether it is in the public interest for building control functions to be performed by those who have a commercial interest in the process, as the recommendation goes. But indeed, we would go further, Madam Deputy Speaker, and say that the evidence of this inquiry is such that commercial interests cannot be in the public interest, and that both the Building Research Establishment and building inspectors should be brought back under public control. We also urge social housing providers to pay particular attention to their new requirements under the Social Housing Act 23 and the need for better inspection and timely remediation of defects. We also strongly endorse the need for a recognised profession of fire engineer. It's important too that our local fire services are properly funded. I was concerned about the reduction in numbers, for example, of appliances at my Taunton fire station, and I've written to Treasury on behalf of the Devon and Somerset Fire and Rescue Authority, asking the government for the flexibility in its funding and tax-raising powers. It's vital that no further reduction of appliances at stations like mine go ahead. In conclusion, Madam Deputy Speaker, we support all 58 recommendations in this report. Whether for local authorities, the fire brigade, tenant management organisations, local authorities, or on personal emergency evacuation plans being put in place. And it's good to see the government establishing that today, or indeed for government itself. Because finally, it is governments of all persuasions, since what's turned out to be a fatally dangerous folly of promoting commercial interest above building and fire safety in the decades from the 80s and 90s, which has let down some of our most vulnerable citizens. That situation has been reviewed many times over the years by governments of all stripes. It's now time to put safety once again before profit. Madam Deputy Speaker.
Florence Eshalomi.
Madam Deputy Speaker, and I want to commend my friend, the Honourable Member for Kensington and Bayswater, for outlining the concerns of his constituents, and I just think in the short 4.5 months he's been here, championing their cause has been central to his role as an MP. Madam Deputy Speaker, this evening, a number of colleagues will touch on some of the technicalities outlined in the report. I want to focus my remarks on the survivors and the victims of Grenfell. The Shadow Secretary of State highlighted that we all remember where we were on that 14th of June 2017. I remember very well where I was because my son was just a week old. He was born on the 7th of June. And as a second mum, because this is my second child, sat up all night, nursing him through the night. And I remember my husband coming into the room saying, "What are you watching? You know, why have you still got the TV on? What film is this?" It wasn't a film. It was real life. And I sat there during the night, which many members probably did as well, just watching that fire. And if you remember back to that scene, there were things dropping and you thought it was items. It was actually people. And so today's debate has to be about the victims of Grenfell, their families and the 72 people who died. In May 2023, last year, I went to the Serpentine Gallery, Madam Deputy Speaker. There was a short film produced by Steve McQueen. And it's a short 24-minute film. And it follows a drone or a helicopter. I think the first thing was a drone. And it's coming in from way out near Heathrow. It comes in, and it's an aerial shot, quite a silent film. At first you can hear the sirens. In the background you can hear the noise. As it gets closer and closer to Grenfell Tower within the distance, it's just silence. And that aerial shot gives you a good overview of the building, and you just see a tall building charred. As the helicopter goes around the building, you can see inside. You can see the debris, you can see the remnants, you can see the forensic cases. But what's glaringly obvious in that film is blackness, the burning. You can almost smell it when you watch that film. For anyone who hasn't seen it, I would definitely challenge you, try and see that film. And I think about the families and the victims and their long justice. We are now going into the 8th year. And this is a fight that they should have never had to endure in the first place. And we as a house must have the courage to deliver a fairer society for them. One where the pain they feel can never ever be inflicted on anyone again. And I cannot imagine, Madam Deputy Speaker, to feel their anger at the deep failures outlined in a Phase 2 report. It outlines over a decade of missed opportunities to identify the risks associated with combustible cladding. And the Shadow Secretary of State quoted it, and the member for Taunton and Wellington also quoted it. And I will quote again: deliberate and sustained strategies from cladding providers to manipulate the testing process, misrepresent the data and mislead the market. Shame on them. And this was compounded by a complete failure of oversight within the government at every level, and the local council who ignored residents when they raised those safety concerns. And Madam Deputy Speaker, the Grenfell disaster represents nothing less than catastrophic failure of duty to provide people with even the most basic level of safety. Yet here we are, more than 7 years down the line, and those responsible for this tragedy have still not been brought to justice. And as a slap in the face, thousands of people up and down the country still go to bed every night knowing that their building is wrapped in this unsafe cladding. Can you imagine the mental toll? We ask these same people to sleep in their houses and not leave during the COVID pandemic, knowing full well that if their building went up in flames, they could not escape. And many of them include my constituents in Vauxhall and Camberwell Green. Like many other members in this House, I've had those conversations with constituents caught up in the cladding scandal through no fault of their own. The ripple effects of this crisis still ruining their lives till today. And Madam Deputy Speaker, we must solve this as a national emergency. Now, I was shocked that the NAO said that we could not expect an end to the remediation until 2035. That would be 18 years after Grenfell, 2035. And so I do welcome the government's commitment to stepping up the pace and finally setting a deadline to 2029 to ensure that this remediation is complete. I also welcome that the government has adopted some of the measures to improve fire safety standards on the 2nd of September, and that they have promised the House that they will address the recommendations of the Phase 2 report within 6 months of its release. And as the chair of the committee, I look forward to this, and I will be holding ministers to account. But as important as these steps are, Madam Deputy Speaker, we cannot pretend that these announcements do enough. They do not address the systematic failures that led to the Grenfell disaster. Now, I would urge everyone, if you haven't already, to read through Part 4 of the report, which outlines how residents felt that the TMO was an uncaring and bullying overload, which belittled them, marginalised them, and regarded them as a nuisance. And Madam Deputy Speaker, this behaviour is something that I saw growing up on a council estate. And it's one that may feel familiar to many of us who also grew up in social housing, because we know the stigma we face and the assumptions made about us. We know the disdain that we face from housing providers. We know how often we are ignored despite knowing our own communities better. And so I take on my honourable friend's challenge in putting it back to the government in how we address the systematic culture. Like I said, it doesn't cost anything to respect your constituents and customers. And we must not ignore how this systematic discrimination of the people and treating them as a box-ticking exercise leads to tragedies like Grenfell. And Madam Deputy Speaker, while there are no recommendations on the TMO and tenant relationship in this report, I urge ministers to look closely at how relationships work and how we can swing the pendulum back to ensure that tenants are listened to. While not mentioned in this report, we must acknowledge that many of those killed in the fire were from a disproportionately black and minority ethnic communities who suffer racism and a hostile environment. I want to speak specifically about disabled people too. They were felled by a basic lack of safety provisions at Grenfell, and they've been felled by delays to the implementation of personal evacuation plans. This leaves disabled people with no clear escape route in a fire, unable to evacuate with everybody else, and simply left to hope and pray and wish that the fire doesn't reach them. Now, Madam Deputy Speaker, I first raised this issue with the then Prime Minister back in 2022, and nothing has changed since then. So I do welcome the government's commitment today to deeper information sharing between authorities and emergency services about the requirements of disabled residents. But I am concerned that ministers are falling short of the full recommendations in the Grenfell inquiry, and I will be following this up with the department. Madam Deputy Speaker, these are people who were never listened to back in 2017, and they're not being heard now. They couldn't hold their local authority to account when their problems were not dealt with. And for some of them, they still can't do it today. So while I urge the government to act on the findings of the Phase 2 report in full, it must go further to address the inequalities at the heart of the Grenfell fire disaster. It's over 7 years since 72 people lost their lives. Yet if we're honest as a house, the problems faced by Grenfell victims are still faced by people up and down the country. This will only be fixed if the government looks beyond targets to address the toxic culture in our housing sector, which Grenfell so tragically exposed. This work demands a lot from all of us, but we can and we must make sure this never happens again.
Sir Bernard Jenkin.
Madam Deputy Speaker, and I do pay tribute to the Honourable Lady for Vauxhall and Camberwell Green for a very moving speech, and from her colleague, the Honourable Gentleman from Kensington and Bayswater. They both spoke very movingly on behalf of the victims of this tragedy who want to see justice done. And I venture to suggest who, above everything, want to know that nothing like this will ever happen again, that whatever happened that night, there would be some glimmer of light at the end of the tunnel, some good will come of this, that this would never ever happen again. And I also praise the Secretary of State for recognising that it's the system itself that needs the most fundamental reform, that the failures of individuals, as I'm becoming to later, whatever incentives there existed, whatever conflicts were unresolved, these are system failures, and the cultural shift will come about as a result of a systemic review, a system change. And you might be asking why I'm taking an interest in this debate. I don't think I represent any community in a high-rise building with cladding problems from leafy Essex, and I suppose the only interest I have to declare is that my late mother turned out she was living in a block with unsafe cladding, and to a very, very limited and minor extent, my family are suffering the loss of being unable to sell my late mother's flat. Very small beer, but I just put that down as an interest I should declare. But I've long taken an interest in safety management systems ever since I was Shadow Secretary of State for Transport at the time of the Ladbroke Grove disaster. And I took an interest about what was being submitted to the inquiry. And I made a submission of my own recommending that there should be a systemic approach to the safety system, and it resulted in the formation of the Rail Accident Investigation Branch of the Department of Transport. The result has been no inquiry into a rail accident has ever taken place again. And similarly, as chairman of the Public Administration and Constitutional Affairs Committee, I took a very close interest in patient safety because we received the reports from the Parliamentary and Health Service Ombudsman. And we had Mid-Staffordshire, we had all the maternity scandals, we had public inquiry after public inquiry, until somebody suggested that actually what there should be is an investigation body answerable to the Secretary of State, accountable, that just looks at why things go wrong in patient care and investigates the causes of incidents without blame, incidentally, but just to find out what went wrong in order to be able to make recommendations and put it right. And this is the lesson drawn from all the really effective safety regimes in other industries that maybe we think should be applied in this case. Now, I co-authored a submission to the Grenfell inquiry with 3 others, with the former Labour Housing and Fire Minister, the Right Honourable Nick Rainsford, and at the time he was also chairman of a body called SICARE, the Construction Industry Council Approved Inspectors Register, which is those private sector building control surveyors, which was referred to by the Honourable Gentleman, I forget which his constituency is, forgive me.
The unforgettable Taunton.
But the point is, I'll come to that conflict which he's very concerned about. Another co-author was a leading figure in building control profession, someone called Kevin Savage, who happens to be a constituent of mine, but that was a coincidence. And third, Keith Conradi, the former chief investigator of the Air Accidents Investigation Branch of the Department of Transport, who, as it happens, became the first chief investigator for the Health Care Services Safety Investigation Body, which is now a statutory body as a result of the inquiry we conducted in my committee. That body, he helped set that body up. He's now retired, but he helped with this submission. Now, Keith Conradi in particular enabled us to understand building safety management as a safety management system. And the events leading to the Grenfell disaster were not just the random failings or crimes of individuals. Where there is culpability, then prosecutions must certainly follow. But that is not the main point. Grenfell and the previous fires, like Lakenhall House, demonstrated there was a comprehensive failure of the safety system, which should exist to keep buildings as safe as possible. So we made our submission in September 21, and the inquiry eventually, after 7 years, a disadvantage of public inquiries, they take a very long time. But I was disappointed that the inquiry did not really find time to engage with our recommendations. They did publish our submission, but from the recommendations, I think it's fair to say that a number of issues have been handed back to the department to be resolved. The paragraph I would suggest recommending, called Implementing Change at 11358, simply suggests that the London Fire Brigade should establish effective standing arrangements for collecting and considering and effectively implementing lessons learned from previous incidents. Well, that's an odd recommendation when you think about it, because the London Fire Brigade was itself very, very severely criticised in the report, and that they should be left responsible for marking their own homework and making recommendations about themselves. I think that underlines that the lacuna in the recommendations is the lack of an investigation body. And there were 2 other paragraphs about building control, which I shall come to, paragraphs 11337 and 11338. But let me start with the And these were our two urgent priorities to address in our submission. By the way, I'm very grateful to the Minister for accepting our request for a meeting, which the Prime Minister promised on the floor of the House when he announced the outcome of the inquiry. We did have a very good meeting with the Fire Minister from the Home Office, and I think she was taken with our recommendations, but I think they do fall to his department, so I'm looking forward to meeting him later this week. I certainly give way, yes.
No, I thank the Right Honourable Member for giving way. And on that point in particular, about the delays in addressing the fire safety issues that pertain to the Grenfell tragedy, these delays are having significant consequences for those people that reside in houses or in buildings, which aren't being remunerated in a timely fashion, particularly in my constituency of Leighton and Wanstead. For example, the residents of Johnson Court have faced over 4 years of uncertainty following a B2 rating, and the progress of remediation has stalled due to disputes between the developer and freeholder. This deadlock has left residents unable to sell, remortgage or feel safe in their homes, so we need faster action and accountability from all parties involved. Does my right honourable friend agree that the government's actions and interventions will be critical to ensure the disputes don't keep delaying this urgently needed work? And as he is discussing, this is fundamentally about leadership.
Well, I'm very happy to both agree with the honourable gentleman and to welcome the Secretary of State's announcements today about accelerating all this and making sure that action is taken much more quickly, which I hope will result in much quicker action for his constituents. But I was just addressing our first major recommendation in our submission to the inquiry, which was there should be established an independent building safety investigation branch of the Ministry of Housing, Communities and Local Government, reporting directly to the Secretary of State. That removes any possible conflict that investigations have with any other part of the system. The idea that the Health and Safety Executive or the new Building Safety Regulator should be conducting investigations is absolutely fine, but you can never guarantee that the Health and Safety Executive or the Building Safety Regulator won't come across a failing of its own and will be conflicted in that investigation. And the public won't have confidence in any investigation they conduct unless there is an independent investigation that looks at all the elements of the system. The Hackett Review rather overlooked this issue and it failed to underline how future fire incidents would be investigated, and this is a gap still to be addressed. The current system of resort to public inquiries, I mean, I think the Honourable Lady for Camberwell confirmed, I mean, this has all taken far too long. And I feel for those who were caught up in the tragedy directly. They have waited far too long. An air accident investigation takes a few months, rarely takes more than a few months, because the capability exists. And in this case, in the Grenfell case, and still the Housing Ombudsman still felt that residents' complaints were dismissed and devalued. I think because the inquiry was overwhelmed with so much material and so many different elements, and had to try and its terms of reference in a way were too wide to be able to capably come up with a comprehensive set of safety system recommendations. It's also notable that though there was an inquiry into the Lacanau house fire, we've had another inquiry into Grenfell. Public inquiries don't seem to resolve the problems. A building safety investigation branch would transform this. It would operate independently. It's modelled on air and marine and rail, the same sort of bodies. And these bodies have proven their worth in both rail and aviation. No public inquiry has taken place into an aviation accident since 1972, and there has not been a public inquiry into a rail accident since the Ladbroke Grove inquiry, because people have confidence in the new independent arrangements. They conduct rapid investigations. They focus not on blame, but understanding failures and issuing binding recommendations for the future. I certainly give way to the Honourable Lady.
Deputy Speaker, I thank the Honourable Gentleman for giving way. And he has spent a lot of time in this House thinking about how systems work. Does he not think that maybe there's now an argument, well, certainly an argument for government to have a proper review process of all coroner's recommendations and all public and other inquiry recommendations, so they don't just get responded to in the moment and then not followed up in the months and years that follow?
It may be a very, very good suggestion, but the point I'm making is you need an apex to your safety system. And whatever else the government does to remediate the safety system as it exists at the moment, they need an independent safety investigator as the apex of the system, which is like the guardian angel over the whole system. And the Honourable the Honourable Gentleman for Kensington and Bayswater said there should be, I think I quote him correctly, an independent oversight body. Well, I think this is the body he seeks, that would be constantly looking for risks in the system, not just investigating accidents, and following up directly to the Secretary of State. This has not been done. Crucially, their independence is what commands the public confidence. They also provide a very significant capability which no other regulator can do, or no regulator can do, because of course a safety investigation body is not a regulator. They provide a legal safe space where anybody can go and say anything without fear nor favour, where witnesses get protection and, if necessary, anonymity, so that they can openly speak without fear of retribution, of being sued, or the words they give in evidence being used against them in court. This creates a culture of openness that accelerates the learning process while maintaining accountability. The introduction of a BSIB would not trespass on any other part of the safety system, such as the HSE or the Building Safety Regulator. It's an essential additional capability which needs to exist, otherwise you don't have that ultimate check over the whole system. Regulators, if necessary, can still run their investigations, as I was saying before. The safe space and the safety investigator does not protect anyone from legal culpability. As we saw when AAIB investigated the Shoreham air crash, they passed a file to the police because they believed there had been a negligence. The pilot was prosecuted. It doesn't protect, the safe space does not protect someone from wrongdoing. I'll give way once more, but I've got rather a lot to say and I don't want to take up too much time.
The right honourable member for giving way in this. Fundamentally, the difference between what he's describing and using the example of air accidents investigation gets at actually what is the heart of this problem, which is the slow pace of coming about justice. The difference between air accident investigation and a public inquiry is that as culpability is identified, it is then passed on for action. The problem with this is we have had an extended period for a public inquiry which has prevented and inhibited the delivery of justice for the people of Grenfell.
Can I remind members that interventions do need to be pithy, short, please? Okay. Sir Bernard Jenkin.
The point. The problem with a public inquiry is it starts from ground zero. It assembles a group of people who may be expert, but most of the lawyers will not be expert, and they have to learn everything from scratch. The advantage of a standing capability is you have experts who are permanently employed, who really understand everything about building safety, in this case it would be. You would have human factors analysts, you would have structural engineers, you would have architects, you would have key people with key skills, fully knowledgeable of the safety system that exists. So they would start immediately after a tragedy and they would conclude much more quickly on the basis of much better expertise. I had hoped that the inquiry would adopt this recommendation, just as the Cullen inquiry into Ladbroke Grove did so, and also the inquiry into offshore safety following the Piper Alpha disaster. It now falls to Government and Parliament to get this right now. The second recommendation that we made in our submission is a comprehensive reform of building control. Building control is the inspection system that should ensure building regulations are followed. Grenfell demonstrated the failure of this system. I accept that there has already been some reform here since we wrote our submission, but much has been said, as was said earlier, about how private sector building inspectors are endemically conflicted because they are appointed and paid for by constructors or others. Just a second, but this misses a horrible truth about the Grenfell inquiry. Ironically, the Grenfell case, ironically, it was the building control function of a local authority, the Royal Borough of Kensington and Chelsea, which failed so disastrously in Grenfell's case. Despite this, everyone's emphasis still seems to be more focused on restricting private sector involvement than reform of the whole building control sector. I will give way to the honourable gentleman in a moment, but my honourable friend was first.
I'm very grateful. He's making a very important speech. One of the things that the Phase 2 report establishes is the system's too fragmented, and he's bringing together under a single regulator, a construction regulator, as he recommends it. Is he see the functions he just outlined in terms of investigations of incidents not fall under the responsibility of that regulator in his view?
No, because a regulator is a part of the system. A safety investigation body stands above the system. Very, very simple. If you're a regulator, you're a participant. You're capable of making mistakes. And you need to be independently investigated or checked that you are not breaching or failing in some way. Through no fault of your own, perhaps. It shouldn't be. Everybody makes mistakes. Most bad things happen because of human error, not because of bad people doing bad things. I'd certainly give way to the honourable gentleman for local government.
I'm very grateful to the right honourable gentleman giving way so many times. Isn't it the case, though, that when you set profit-making companies against local authorities, you end up with a race to the bottom across the board? Isn't that the evidence of the inquiry? And I had cause to look at the original debate in the 1980s of bringing in these private inspectors, in which that less than an entirely left-wing organisation, the Royal Institution of Chartered Surveyors, actually said they were opposed to taking building control away from local authorities.
I'm not in favour of taking building control away from local authorities. The problem that if we go down the route that he's recommending is that we will not succeed in making buildings safer, least of all because there is a shortage of capacity in the sector, and if one decides that you can't have any private sector building control surveyors, then you'll have even less capacity, and remediating all this will take even longer. And there's nothing but an approach that relies entirely on local government or a state body of building control risks actually worsening a situation that we're already experiencing. The building control force is ageing, and recruitment struggles to keep up with demand. Restricting private sector competition will exacerbate these problems, driving skilled professionals not back into local authorities because they can't afford them. They go into consultancy roles where they'd be working for the construction companies directly, not inspecting what they are doing. Instead of narrowing the pool of inspectors, we should be raising the standards of building control across the board. Private sector approved inspectors were already the subject of a strict licensing regime through the Construction Industry Council approved inspectors register. They had a code of conduct and regular audited complaints process. But I would just point out as well, the private sector building control sector was not responsible for the problem at Grenfell. It was the local authority. And our recommendation suggested a fully integrated building control service involving both local authorities and registered building control approvers, working to common standards within a framework designed to promote continuous improvement is the right answer. You would have, to deal with the high-rise blocks, you have multidisciplinary teams set up to perform the building control function, and they should be recruited on the basis of proven skills and experience from both public and private sectors on a level playing field, without the choice being biased in favour of the former. That should be the government's objective, I submit. We welcome the steps to require all building inspectors, whether working for local authorities or registered building control approvers, to be individually registered by BSR. That's a step in the right direction, but further steps can and should be taken to drive up standards and to maximise much needed capacity. However, the recommendations in the inquiry of 113.37 and 113.38 in the final report of the inquiry could actually undermine this process. Implicit in recommendation 113.37 is the assumption that it is inappropriate for private sector commercial organisations to be involved in building control work at all, though actually no evidence is advanced to support this assumption. It is an assumption that many people make, but there's no basis of evidence for it. Recommendation 113.37 proposes it should be a panel to consider the matter. I hope it will, and we hope this panel will conclude that private sector bodies should no longer be permitted to carry out building control. If this body did decide to ban private sector building control, this would seriously aggravate the capacity problem that we've described. I will certainly give way to the one because it's a crucial point, and I'm welcome.
Just to ask for a clarification, I thank the Right Honourable for giving way. But surely the issue, as was raised earlier, is that there is a conflict of interest when you are paying to have your product assessed. And as we know from Sir Martin's report, there was a cover-up of testing results. Exactly. So if you accept that, how do you get around this conflict of interest issue?
Just one moment, please. And I recognise that the Honourable Member, I'm not about to admonish him for using the word you, but Sir Bernard, you have now spoken for longer than both front benches put together, and I'm many members who wish to get in.
I'm extremely grateful for that question, because that was a failure of regulation. And the crucial point is this: in other safety critical industries, such as civil aviation, or rail, or marine, there is no ban on the private sector being selected to do inspections. Employees of airlines, employees of aircraft manufacturers, employees of aircraft engine manufacturers, they do the inspections, but they are independently regulated by the CAA and overseen and certified by the CAA. Just because they're employed by the airlines or they're employed by commercial interests does not make them incapable of objective judgment, and the whole aviation sector flies incredibly safely on the basis of aircraft being inspected not by government inspectors or public employees, but by the private sector. I give way very briefly.
My experience in the aviation industry included overseeing and being part of the record-keeping process for inspections. Wouldn't the Right Honourable Member agree that this requirement to record and to store all successful and unsuccessful testing results would resolve some of the issues that we've seen in this in the Grenfell disaster, where unsuccessful test results were hidden and they're not accessible publicly?
I completely agree with the Honourable Gentleman. The record keeping of airlines, of engine manufacturers, air engine manufacturers, of aircraft maintenance companies has to be absolutely meticulous, and that is inspected by the CAA. But the record keeping and the inspections are a result. The information originally comes from inspections conducted by people who are employed by the private sector, and I think he's agreeing with me. And it's the regulation that we need to tackle, not indulge in shorthand for somehow anybody making a profit must be guilty. And let me say, I abhor the idea of people making a profit at the expense of safety, but that's not what happens in these other industries. So in summary, Madam Deputy Speaker, the success of independent accident investigation or safety investigation branches in other sectors speaks for itself. Aviation and rail safety has much fuller public confidence and a lower accident rate under these models, delivering safety improvements faster, more effectively and at lower cost than traditional public inquiries. And reforming building control, meanwhile, would ensure that all inspectors operate under a consistent and rigorous oversight, whether they are public or private sector. And in conclusion, our proposals are not just about learning from the Grenfell tragedy, but they are preventing the next disaster. The inquiry shows the systemic failures in building safety and regulation that led to an avoidable tragedy. And I regret to have to warn the House, if we do not get this right, if we do not finish working on what the inquiry has presented to us and fill in the gaps, there will one day be another Grenfell, just as Grenfell was a repeat of earlier safety failures. We have an obligation finally to get this right for the Grenfell community and for the memory of those who died and for future communities. And the government now has the opportunity to follow up the inquiry, to build on its findings and put in place the institutional arrangements that will embed learning and safety improvement in residential building management in a comprehensive safety system which matches other safety critical industries. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Andy Slaughter.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. 7.5 years on from the Grenfell Tower fire, it often feels that we are no further forward than the last debate or silent walk or stage of the inquiry. There have been no prosecutions, no accountability, and insufficient movement on remediation of buildings, including those with flammable cladding. In the last 7 years, a lot has happened. The Windrush scandal, Brexit, 4 changes of the Prime Minister, a new monarch, a global pandemic. But little has changed for the families and survivors of Grenfell Tower. They're still waiting for justice, still waiting for answers, and their trauma endures. That trauma which each of the survivors bears is incomprehensible to those of us who've never experienced such a horrific event in our lives. Children who lived in the tower have described finding candles and bonfires trigger their fears, and they worry about the safety of even ordinary electrical items in their home. Those worries should be very far from a child's mind, but unfortunately they are ever present and lasting. We are simply not doing enough to prevent this from happening again. This in itself is re-traumatising to those who know firsthand how devastating a fire in a tower block can be. The Fire Safety Act 2021, Building Safety Act 2022 and the appointment of a building safety regulator were all steps taken by the previous government in response to phase 1 of the Grenfell inquiry, but gaping holes in safety regulations still remain. Phase 2 of the inquiry asked for a more cohesive approach. It points to the confusing situation of multiple government departments holding responsibility for fire safety and the need for a unified response to regulation under a single construction regulator. In order to learn from mistakes, we cannot allow another situation where warnings are missed, accountability falls through the cracks, and responsibility is denied or passed on. But while the Phase 2 recommendations seek to fix the gap in fire safety to prevent future deaths, we must not lose sight of justice for the victims of the fire and the survivors who await the identification of those responsible. The delays to prosecutions are increasingly unacceptable. The former Director of Public Prosecutions, Lord MacDonald, has said that the biggest barrier to justice is the precarious state of our criminal justice system. He estimates that criminal trials for those responsible may not begin until 2029. We cannot accept that. I'm pleased that there's been an uplift by the Chancellor to both the Ministry of Justice and the Law Office's budget to fix our justice system. But visits recently, which I undertaken with the Justice Committee to courts, conversations with the senior judiciary, show that the backlogs in our courts continue and can continue to delay justice. I know the Lord Chancellor is committed to fixing these issues, but we have to make haste. And I join calls from survivors that criminal trials and civil trials must be expedited. The victims of Grenfell should not have to wait as long as the victims of Hillsborough for justice. I'd like to just move on briefly to talk about the site itself where the tower stands to this day. Many have spoken about its re-traumatising impact on the community, as the tower stands as a monolithic reminder of the tragic and horrific events of that night. It is visible from all across West London. including from my constituency, including from high-rise blocks in my constituency, and including those that themselves have experienced fires, but thankfully without fatalities. The report drawn up by the Grenfell Memorial Commission shows what needs to be included and what design choices are important to the bereaved. I understand the competition to design the memorial is running until spring of next year, and I will be grateful if we can have on the record a commitment from the government that once they have the plans of the approved design in front of them, there will be no further delays. The completion of the memorial will give bereaved families and survivors a place to gather and remember their loved ones. It's important to the community that we get this right, but we must also get on with it. I want to mention remediation, another delayed and underfunded response to the findings of Phase 1 of the report. Under the previous government, social landlords were excluded from government funding for remediation to their buildings, which were deemed to have unsafe cladding. I never understood the justification of that decision by the previous Levelling Up Secretary, but I'm pleased the Chancellor in her budget has committed to a further £1 billion investment for remediation, and that social landlords will no longer be excluded from financial assistance. There's also a commitment to go faster with the works, very welcome as there remain 4,000 buildings across the country with unsafe cladding. But I know they're still concerned that the money allocated does not meet the reality of costs for social landlords, which is estimated at around £6 billion. Those who currently live in unsafe social housing deserve to be safe and feel safe. To find the money, social landlords have made cutbacks, and unfortunately that has come from future building programmes. As a result, national figures show that affordable housing starts have fallen by 39%. A number of housing associations that have either had to merge or been taken over, and we've heard from the member for Kensington and Bayswater that even very large associations like Notting Hill Genesis are finding themselves in financial trouble. In the social housing sector, funding is currently only available for buildings over 18 metres with ACM cladding and 11 metres, over 11 metres for those buildings with combustible cladding that house leaseholders. That means that often social tenants are the only people footing the bill for remediation works through their rents, because private developers have much easier access to funds to fix their building, and leaseholders are eligible for government schemes. Using rental income to fund building safety works leaves little money left over for social landlords to carry out routine maintenance, a lose-lose for social housing tenants, many of whom are vulnerable and low-income families. Finally, and in the light of the time, I'm not going to go over these issues in detail as I would like, but I do commend some of the briefings that we've had in preparation for this debate from the Royal Institute of British Architects, from Rockwall, talking about the need to fireproof buildings, either to retrofit them, to the use of sprinklers, to ensure that we have two fireproof staircases in buildings. I do not know why buildings over 11 stories are not included. I don't know why all buildings which contain vulnerable residents, such as care homes and schools, are not included in having no combustible cladding allowed in them. I do find it extraordinary that we're still allowing some buildings to be built with combustible materials on them, even in the light of what happened at Grenfell. I also want to mention the cause of fire very briefly. In July of this year, there was a fire, the latest of a series of fires, in a high-rise block in my constituency, caused by the failure of a battery pack on a converted e-bike. Thankfully, no one was killed, but the outcome could have been much worse had the London Fire Brigade not acted as swiftly as they did. The batteries in these products are lithium-ion, and if they catch fire, there's a high chance of explosion. We know the Grenfell Tower fire was started by a faulty fridge freezer. The year before, Shepherd's Court, a high-rise block on Shepherd's Green, less than a mile from Grenfell, there was a very serious fire caused by another electrical device, a tumble dryer. These hundreds of these are happening every year. So, in conclusion, I would say this, Madam Deputy Speaker, I know that the Deputy Prime Minister and the Prime Minister are committed to justice in this matter, to building safety and to a proper memorial at the site. They've shown their commitment to justice for bereaved families and survivors through the Hillsborough Law. They have made positive steps to fund remediation works, and I'm convinced they will move swiftly on plans for the memorial site. I would ask also that they look at the recommendations from the organisation Inquest, that we should have a national oversight mechanism. So when there are recommendations like this, 58 recommendations from this inquiry, they are follow-up and they are implemented. And that goes for both public inquiries and prevention of future death reports issued by coroners. It's all very well having good recommendations. If they're not pursued, they become worthless. We must move quicker, more decisively, and continue to keep the survivors and bereaved families at the forefront of our minds, so as not to prolong the trauma and heartache of a community that's already been badly let down time and time again.
Shockat, Adam.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I'd like to refer the House to my registered interest as a leaseholder. I welcome this debate, and in particular the Deputy Prime Minister's considered, sympathetic and empathetic contribution. And I agree with her wholeheartedly that the Grenfell disaster was caused by systematic failures across the board, including the government or governments and the private sector, where commercial gain was prioritised over people's life, while a broken system allowed the unfettered competition to bulldoze through what little regulation was in place. As articulated by my honourable friend from Vauxhall and Camberwell Green, we all remember where we were that evening. And it was the month of Ramadan, and we were coming home from from evening prayers. And my heart broke twice that evening. One was seeing the victims in front of me on our television screens and mobile phones. And the second was knowing that those victims, as who they were going to have to wait and age for justice. But even I didn't perceive that it was going to take this long. The 72 people who died on that terrible night, their relatives, the bereaved and survivors deserve justice. And this can happen with real change to the building system, safety system from top to bottom. And that is why I welcome the Deputy Prime Minister's commitment to putting into place all 58 recommendations, but this has to be done as soon as possible. Furthermore, we welcome the Deputy Prime Minister's expedition of remediation of the unsafe cladding. It simply has taken just too long. As on 9th of September, the Under-Secretary of State for Housing, Communities and Local Government said, in answer to a parliamentary question, that speeding up the remediation of buildings is absolutely critical. 7 years on from Grenfell, action has been far too slow, and the fire in Dagenham is a horrific reminder of the risk unsafe cladding still poses for too many people. That is why for the 49 private tenants of Abbey House, an 8-storey block in Leicester South with dangerous cladding, that remediation cannot come too quickly. However, they are caught between a bureaucratic rock and a commercial hard place. The freehold of that block is owned by Leicester City Council, but in 2015 the Mayor granted a 150-year lease to a private company to refurbish the block as private rented accommodation. As the block contains no individual leaseholders, it is not eligible for any government funding for cladding remediation. This is clearly intolerable for the residents of that block. Whilst the toing and froing goes on about who should remediate the blocks, the residents, as you can imagine, are living in constant fear that their block is unsafe, and the lack of resolution just makes it worse. As mentioned by the Honourable Member for Kensington and Bayswater, if the government is truly serious about making homes safe, ownership issues such as those at Abbey House cannot be allowed to get in the way of removing unsafe cladding and other materials. Would the Deputy Prime Minister agree that it is now essential that government funds are made available across the board to make all our buildings safe urgently, And once that is done, then issues of who is responsible and how to reclaim the costs can be resolved. Thank you.
I call Kumaran.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I start by paying tribute to my honourable friend, for the member for Kensington and Bayswater, who is the voice of his community, and he's given a moving tribute today. As we've heard, it's now been more than 7 years since 72 people lost their lives in the devastating fire in Grenfell Tower. Our thoughts are with the bereaved families, the survivors, the residents and the local community. That this tragic fire happened in modern Britain is a scandal, and it should fill us all with deep anger and fear. Every single person was let down by failure of almost every single institution that existed to serve them, and decades of failure by the state. My honourable friend for Vauxhall and Camberwell spoke powerfully of the moment she first saw the tragedy. I'll never forget as I saw those images. I travelled past not even 48 hours after. The embers, the smoke, the smell, that memory will stay with me forever. The Grenfell community has demonstrated enormous strength and courage in giving evidence to the inquiry, and they've campaigned tirelessly for justice. Justice for the victims and the families of Grenfell Tower, and justice so that this tragedy can never befall another community. Madam Deputy Speaker, in my constituency of Stratford and Bow, we sit between the boroughs that have the highest number of high-rise cladded blocks in the country. There are over 400 buildings with unsafe cladding in Tower Hamlets and over 200 in Newham. I welcome that the Deputy Prime Minister said today that Tower Hamlets was the first to obtain a remediation order. But there is still so much more to be done. This means in my constituency there are thousands of residents who, through no fault of their own, have found themselves caught up in a cladding scandal. I've been inundated by my constituents contacting me about feeling unsafe in their own homes. I've sat with them as they've told me deeply personal stories, through tears and anger. Unable to move, to be with their dying mother who's dying of cancer, the impact on their mental health, unable to start a family, stuck in homes where their life savings are trapped in unmortgageable properties. The sheer scale of anger and distrust and betrayal in these circumstances, through no fault of their own, that my constituents feel sits heavily with me. I share their frustration, and I know it's a frustration I can feel around this house today. A frustration at the pace of the remediation works. These works are already long overdue, and for many, they still feel years away. It's shameful that 7 years after Grenfell, remediation has been completed on less than 50% of mid and high-rise buildings with unsafe cladding. We've seen recently terrifying fire in Dagenham. That's why residents around the country, it's why residents in Stratford and Bow are living in fear of what happens to them in the event of a fire. But this is not the end of it, Madam Deputy Speaker. Many leaseholders, including shared owners, feel trapped in properties they're unable to sell, facing significant financial uncertainty and distress. In my constituency, residents in East Village, the site of the former athletes' village from the Olympics, in Olympic Park, have been left in a protracted legal battle between different stakeholders over who is liable for remediation costs and delaying essential works. Residents of Thomas Fire Drive are still waiting for works to start, despite their service charges going up, with some stuck in the leasehold trap because they can't sell their property. Many feel that saving face and saving cost has been prioritised over their safety. The distress and frustration is palpable, and the situation is becoming untenable for many. I know the government shares my view that every person deserves to feel safe and be safe and secure in the place they live and call home. Sadly, for too many of my constituents and too many constituents of members around this House and around the country, they fear the victims of being yet another Grenfell-level style tragedy, and it remains ever present. I'll finish by asking if the Minister will meet with me to discuss the cases in my constituency, because we do have the highest number of high-rise cladded blocks in the country. I acknowledge that the Minister has inherited a shameful situation from the previous government, and it's completely scandalous that the remediation was so slow. I welcome the work that this Labour government is taking to put it right. In particular, today's announcement that for the first time, commits to remediating all high-rise buildings with unsafe cladding in a government-funded scheme by 2029. And I'm pleased that the Deputy Prime Minister said today that we want to go much further. At the election, we made a promise that we would speed up the removal of unsafe cladding. Madam Deputy Speaker, today we are acting on that promise. But too many leaseholders in my constituency have had to pay the price of removal of unsafe cladding that they had no role in putting up. I welcome the reforms today for renters, giving tenants a seat at the table, and to the Speaker of Social Housing. But I would urge the Minister to make sure that the cost of remediation does not fall on leaseholders, and that we do take into account all the views and give everybody a seat at the table. When we say never again, we truly must mean it, Madam Deputy Speaker. We must act to learn the lessons so that another Grenfell tragedy can never again be repeated. I join colleagues on these benches and urge the Government to act on the findings of the Phase 2 report in full and address the inequalities in housing. The inequalities that we see through class, through race, through disability. There is still so much more to be done, and I welcome us working together so that this never again happens.
Tessa Mullins. Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I'd like to associate myself with the Deputy Prime Minister and my colleague, the Lib Dem spokesperson, in recognition of the pain and grief and hurt that's caused to so many who lived in and were connected to the tragedy where 72 lives were lost at Grenfell Tower. I've heard the sombre comments in this debate, and I mean no disrespect in speaking today on a matter of understanding and interpretation of the legislation that's been passed subsequently, namely the anomaly of non-qualified leaseholder status as it affects my constituents. My constituents own a one-bedroom flat in North Somerset, not a penthouse, nothing luxurious, simply a home. They purchased it with a 999-year lease in 2015. It was a new build, so still theoretically covered by the NHBC 10-year guarantee. So they believed it would be ideal as a long-term rental property without too many maintenance issues ahead. In August of this year, a neighbouring flat went up for sale. The buyer's solicitors asked for an up-to-date fire risk appraisal. This prompted the management company to organise a fire risk appraisal of the external walls. The report came back strongly recommending that cladding remediation work was required. My constituents would have known none of this had it not been for the seller keeping them in the loop. Now, the new financial protections in the Building Safety Act 2022 apply to leaseholders in buildings above 11 metres or 5 storeys in height with historical safety defects. From 28th of June 2022, qualifying leaseholders in England could no longer be charged for cladding remediation, and there are legal protections for non-cladding costs. The accompanying secondary legislation came into force on the 20th and 21st of July 2022. The government is clear that developers must pay to fix buildings they had a role in developing or refurbishing, even where they no longer own the building. That seems right. The Act ensures that building owners who are or are associated with the developer must pay for the remediation of historical defects. The courts have been granted new powers to extend liability to associated companies. This ensures that civil cases for claims against defective buildings can be brought against companies associated with the developer, preventing the use of complex corporate structures to avoid liability. Qualifying leaseholders are protected from all cladding system remediation costs. Those whose property is calculated at being worth less than £175,000 outside London, or £325,000 in Greater London, or whose building owner has a group net worth of more than £2 million per relevant building, as of the 14th of February 2022, are exempt from all historical safety remediation costs. The Act also includes a robust package of measures designed to ensure that those responsible finally put right the buildings they've contributed to making so dangerous, and that leaseholders are firmly protected from unfair costs of remediation that they previously faced. No one could disagree this is, on the face of it, fair. Unfortunately, the previous government failed to notify any leaseholders, qualifying or non-qualifying, of the implications of the Building Safety Act 2022, which came into force on the 28th of June 2022. However, 4 months ago, my constituents had no knowledge of non-qualified leaseholder status, which had been bestowed on them without any prior notice or consultation. My constituents' legal rights as leaseholders had been significantly changed, backdated to the 14th of February 2022. This is because the threshold for non-qualified leasehold status cuts in at ownership of 4 properties as of that date, that February date. It's very hard to find definitions of non-qualified leaseholder status on the government website. There's plenty about qualified leasehold status, but very little about non-qualified. The Parliamentary Under-Secretary of State has confirmed that, weirdly, under the previous governance legislation, a couple can own 5 properties, providing they own their primary home jointly, and the other two other properties each. But a couple who owns 4 properties jointly become non-qualifying leaseholders. Who on earth can think that is fair? This will discriminate against couples and families more than sophisticated business entities, which are probably the intended target of this legislation.
Did my honourable friend give way?
Of course.
Does my honourable friend agree that the Grenfell Tower inquiries laid bare the failure of successive governments in their duty of care to citizens, a catastrophic culture of carelessness which has caused untold suffering, and that the government must act urgently to assist all leaseholders, including those currently excluded, such as non-qualifying leaseholder residents like my constituents, who are unfairly left in financial and emotional turmoil through no fault of their own?
I'll thank my honourable friend for her intervention. Yes, I would agree that, and I'll come on to some of those things that have happened as a result of that since. So I was mentioning that sophisticated business entities are probably the intended target of this legislation. So there's fairly good news for people who've divided their property assets, and pretty bad luck for those who jointly own their property investors, which is terribly random criteria. It was shocking enough for them to find that their 9-year-old building, in which my constituents' flat sits, had a cladding issue, but due to the fact they owned jointly 4 properties on the 14th of February 2022, they're left largely unprotected. They're not like the developers or the cladding suppliers. Not only this, but their status as non-qualified leaseholders has been attached to their flat in perpetuity. So even after all the remediation work has taken place and centuries have passed, currently another 990 years, even after this period, and they've departed this world, every future owner of their flat inherits the same diminished lease, whilst neighbouring flats are protected from the costs of making the building safe. So the impact of this legislation is profound. Solicitors are advising their clients not to buy any flat with the attached non-qualified leasehold status, even after the fire safety work has been completed. Lenders are refusing to lend on property with this status. The values are expected to reduce considerably, possibly by as much as 50%. Estate agents realise that trying to sell properties with this status is pretty much a lost cause. Non-qualified leaseholders can't sell their flats, and they are mostly flats, and they can't mitigate the risks they've been exposed to. And if a leaseholder has a 75% mortgage and the value drops by 50%, it's easy to see how financial crisis can hit very ordinary people who've saved hard, invested in bricks and mortar, and are providing homes for rent all over the country, helping alleviate our housing crisis. Insurance premiums are sky high. If this continues, it's quite likely that lenders will not want to take possession if there is a default on the mortgage, as they themselves will become liable. Leaving a flat with this status in a will may expose family and friends to long-term problems associated with this status, potentially inheriting a liability, not an asset. The legislation has removed a whole tier of property from ever-increasing numbers of young buyers and those who want to downsize, so particularly the young and older citizens. It's clear that without the support of surveyors and agents and solicitors and lenders, it's going to become increasingly hard to secure one's first or last home. Whatever one's political ideals, surely we all agree that there's a terrible shortage of affordable homes, and the affordable end of the market often comes in the shape of a leasehold flat. I cannot find the path of logic through this legislation. I have no idea who tried to think this one through. I recognise it wasn't the Minister. It seems deeply unfair that someone's legal rights can be different from those who also own flats in the same building. Just because my constituents had in their ownership on the 14th of February 4 or more properties, can the Minister try and explain the logic? Although I recognise he didn't write the legislation, it would be nice even maybe if his opposite number would have a crack at trying to tell me how this works. I just don't get it. It's a bit like having your car recalled for a safety issue, and then you have to pay for the correction to the problem yourself, and then any other safety problem in the future due to the fact that you and your family have 3 other cars between you today, and you might want to sell the car once it's safe and the safety fault's fixed. This is madness. So the Parliamentary Under-Secretary of State for Local Growth and Building Safety is on record as having confirmed that the Building Safety Act 2022 was written to safeguard the health and safety of those who live in the affected building. So, if a non-qualified leaseholder has a leasehold flat as their principal home, they are protected. My question is, what about the tenants who live in the flats owned by a private landlord who are in this trap? Are they not important enough to be protected too? Parliamentary Under-Secretary of State for Local Growth and Building Safety, in a letter dated last month, has further confirmed that once the property is brought up to standard and safety remedies are completed, then in years ahead, and I quote, the expectation is that the qualification point should essentially become moot. That's the end of the quote. When you read the government's guidelines, there's plenty about non-qualifying leasehold status remaining with the property in perpetuity. There is absolutely nothing that I can find about it becoming moot. I wonder how the Minister sees this being legislated for. On the subject of government guidelines, so complicated are they and so hard to interpret that solicitors are at loggerheads over their ramifications. My constituents management company initially confirmed they would be liable for all the costs associated with the cladding remediation works, even if the building was accepted into the cladding safety scheme. That was until they were able to get the Ministry of Housing, Communities and Local Government to write to them confirming that they would be protected under the cladding safety scheme. But it fell to them to get proof and to convince their management company. Worse than this, the Government Department advises others to contact LEASE, the Leasehold Advisory Service, in order to establish their rights. LEASE confirmed both on the phone and in writing that my constituents did not qualify for any help or support within the cladding safety scheme. They were advised by others in the same predicament to contact the Ministry of Housing, Communities and Local Government. Can the Minister confirm who says that non-qualified leaseholders are covered by the cladding safety scheme? These are government departments set up to help and guide people like my constituents, and yet they're giving completely conflicting advice. This situation has caused my constituents anguish and sleepless nights and constant worry as to the possible life-changing financial burden that may be heading their way if this government doesn't sort this out so that advice is clear and consistent. I think we're all lost. Will the Minister agree to meet with my constituents and me to discuss this matter of non-qualified leaseholder status further as soon as possible, please? Thank you.
Members will have realised there's a lot of members that want to speak in this debate, so I am afraid that in order to help each other, I'm going to have to impose a 4-minute time limit. Ben Coleman.
And I fully understand the challenge you've been faced with. So I'll do my best to do this in 4 minutes. It's an honour to follow so many the Deputy Prime Minister and honourable friends and members, and it's an honour also to have so many people up in the gallery who've been sitting patiently listening to this debate, having suffered so much over the years. Madam Deputy Speaker, I'd like to also begin, as others have, by recalling the 15 disabled people who died in the Grenfell Tower fire because there was no plan in advance to ensure they could evacuate in the crisis, and I'm pleased that the Government today published its response to the consultation that is introducing a set of measures on residential personal emergency evacuation plans. But I also say I agree with Grenfell United that personal emergency evacuation plans for disabled residents must be mandated. That's essential. And Deputy Speaker, let me turn to other matters that my honourable friends have set out so well. The report is absolutely scathing about the Royal Borough of Kensington and Chelsea and its tenant management organisation. What leaps out from the report, of page after page, is the Council's absolute lack of respect for so many of its residents, how they refuse to listen to people living in social housing when they raise concerns again and again about the Grenfell building that eventually contributed to the terrible fire, how they treated dissenting voices as enemies, and then once the terrible fire had happened, how they treated their own residents. And at the time, I was a councillor in the neighbouring borough of Hammersmith and Fulham, and the day after, we became aware as a council, purely by chance, that Kensington and Chelsea Council had placed Grenfell residents in hotels in our borough, because some of the residents happened to wander down to the local West Kensington and Gibbs Green estate, where they were given food and shelter and clothing and clean clothes, and they happened to mention they'd been placed in the Holiday Express in Fulham. And then the residents mentioned this to the leader of the council. He got council officers to go to all the hotels in the borough, and we discovered that they were full of residents from Grenfell, and no one in Kensington and Chelsea had tried to tell us. I think the report talks about the council's response as being muddled and piecemeal. Perhaps another word is cruel. So teams from the Council, Hammersmith and Fulham Council, kept a close eye, visited every week, looked after the residents as best they could, and Andy Slot, forgive me, the Member of Parliament for Hammersmith, and as he was at the time, came and he sat on the grass with the residents of Grenfell who were at the West Kensington Gibbs Green estate, and they said, "Are you really a Member of Parliament?" Because no one official from our borough has been to see us at all. So I can't speak highly enough of how the community responded. And I am keenly aware that where the council failed, it was the community that got it right. Now, the council in Kensington and Chelsea says it is determined to learn from what it got wrong, and this is very welcome. And it's welcome that the scope of their review is also going to explicitly consider racial as well as social discrimination. And I look forward to that being the case. But I have to say I have some serious questions about still whether they really get it. Because thousands of my Chelsea constituents live in social housing, and time again, they say they don't feel their voices are being heard, they don't feel the culture has changed. And indeed, just Friday before last, I decided to call a meeting on the Wells End estate to talk about some serious crime issues. A man from another estate had sadly been stabbed and died in an altercation, and I invited all the residents to come and have a conversation with me about it. To my surprise, senior councillors from Kensington and Chelsea Conservative Council tried to dissuade me. They said they'd already engaged with residents. Another meeting would bring no more benefit. Well, in the event, more than 50 residents came. We had a great conversation. Not everyone agreed with each other, but everybody had a chance to speak. Everybody had a chance to be heard. And only one thing really shocked me, and that was... tense moment there, and that was that at the end of the meeting, and even during the meeting, the number of residents who said they'd lived all their lives on the estate, or decades on the estate, and this was the first time that they'd ever been to a meeting like this on the estate, that they'd felt listened to. So I hope, Madam Deputy Speaker, as I sum up, that residents will be listened to, and I hope, if I may, that we have a debate like this every year so that we can look at the recommendations. I'd like to request the front bench that they enable that to happen, and I'm grateful for the time to speak.
Order. I call Iqbal Mohammed.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I also start by joining the Deputy Prime Minister expressing my sincere condolences to the families tragically impacted by this avoidable disaster. And I welcome her statement and the positive steps and actions she's outlined to address the findings of the inquiry. Now, I welcome the plans to introduce heavy penalties on those failing to meet repair deadlines, but I share the concerns of campaigners that the timescales for making properties safe are way too long. The Minister may say the government is taking decisive action, but the Building Safety Fund was first opened for registration in 2020. A target of 2029 must not be for the first building to be remediated, but must be guaranteed as the last. For over 7 years, residents and leaseholders have continued to live with a mental anguish that properties that they and their families go to sleep in every night are unsafe, aware that what happened to the residents of Grenfell could well happen to them. As we've heard, residents also face extortionate home insurance bills and rising costs for repairs that should be the sole responsibility of the developers, while leaseholders face ruin, financially trapped in properties they bought in good faith but were built in bad faith. To widen the argument and the issue at hand, the picture of property developers cutting corners to make profit and disregarding human life in the process is one before Grenfell we wanted to believe belonged to a bygone era. Unfortunately, it is very much the reality of the 21st century Britain, where a culture has become embedded, where corporate bosses think they can get away with cutting corners in the pursuit of profit. We have seen its ugly imprint again and again, whether it's government lobbyists scamming the public purse during the COVID crisis, or water companies polluting our rivers, or blatant disregard for truth and basic decency in the Post Office Horizon scandal, or people being burnt alive in buildings not fit for purpose. The only way to root out that culture is regulation to protect the public from those who seek to exploit them. I am concerned, therefore, that the Deputy Prime Minister does not go nearly far enough in this regard. We know the property industry in general is rife with profiteering, and I'm concerned we will see more of the same as property agents hike up fees and earn hundreds of millions of pounds in the process by charging administration fees on works to make buildings safe. When in opposition, the Labour Party committed to preventing this by calling for nationalisation of the process of fixing high-rise flats to eliminate administration fees, and I would encourage the government to pursue this policy. I would also like the Deputy Prime Minister to consider that the risk assessment is not only is also applied to buildings under 11 metres. I believe campaigners are right to say not only that there must be a comprehensive risk assessment that applies to buildings of all heights, but also that building safety crises go far beyond external cladding, and a holistic approach must give equal consideration to non-cladding defects.
Order. I call Darren Paffey.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Can I thank the Deputy Prime Minister for her statement and obviously associate myself with her words as she reminds us that we remember once again the victims, the survivors and those left behind after the tragedy of 72 entirely preventable deaths in the Grenfell Tower. There are many lessons to be learned from this tragedy, and residents in Southampton-Itchen, especially those in the 46 blocks affected still by unsafe cladding, are looking anxiously on to see if we learn those lessons. These are some of the people who know far too well and far too personally just how slow the progress has been to make all buildings safe. So as this government embarks on our ambitious plan to build 1.5 million new homes, we, and importantly, those who will call those houses their home, need to know that they are safe. But that peace of mind is sadly not something yet felt by many residents in my constituency, where an unacceptably high number still live in buildings affected by cladding or fire safety risks. Some remediation has happened, and that's to be welcomed, but in too many places it's not happening fast enough, or leaseholders are paying the price in countless examples that we've heard from honourable members today, including those who live in blocks which don't meet the 11-metre threshold and who are getting unexpected bills for tens of thousands of pounds through their letterbox. I recently held a public meeting with constituents awaiting fire safety works, and among the many who came to share their experiences, Ellie has seen her service charges soar from £1,600 a year to over £6,000 and has no idea how she'll afford it. In the same block, Stuart told me he feels like no one cares after the same service charge hike has left him and his family trapped in a property that they've outgrown. Just down the road, Daniel's not only facing escalating service charges of £3,000, but his insurance now tops £4,000 on top of his rent, on top of his regular bills. James happens to live in one part of a taller development where his building is under 11 metres, yet he's facing remediation charges of between £15,000 and £30,000. They can't decide yet how much they're going to charge residents. This is simply not acceptable. And others have told me about the changes they want to see implemented. So in the time left, I want to make my constituents' views and voices heard in this place. They want that clearly defined single construction regulator who can channel efforts to drive change, and I'm sure they'll welcome today's announcements. Many are stuck in unsellable flats, and they couldn't tell you who exactly is responsible for keeping them safe. That needs to change. They want to see a much clearer role for managing agents. What exactly are their responsibilities and what standards will they be held to? They want to see improved regulation around insurance and service charges, again, something which is touched on in the report, so that they are not charged for remediation works through the back door. That's simply not fair. With an eye to the future, people want to see us move away from the feudal system of leasehold, and that's something this government is committed to delivering. And they want to see that much better quality housing in the future so that they can move into places where they know they are safe. In short, people want, need and deserve a way out of this mess. Now, the Remediation Action Plan shows that this government is taking these issues seriously, and I would just urge ministers that even where deadlines are set, we can move even quicker where possible. But we've begun that crucial work to put right this scandal, and we must not rest until that is done in full.
Sian Berry. Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I'm here to talk by and large about the people, their treatment and their rights today. And I'm sorry I don't have more time to do the topic justice. I was a London Assembly member in 2017 when the disaster happened, and I had been for 1 year. And the Grenfell disaster had such a huge impact on my work and me personally ever since. I'll never, ever forget the many things that I saw and heard. I'll never forget the smells, the burned debris on the garden hedges, the community shock and heartbreak. Its spirit, as it called me and many other elected representatives down there to try to deal with the issues they themselves were dealing with and identifying. The people around Grenfell, the victims, the 72 people killed that day, they're constantly in my heart when I work on any related issue. On that day, I was also a councillor in Camden, and a few days later, 5 of our blocks had to be evacuated due to related issues. And so I've got a perspective there on dealing with a non-fatal, but nevertheless really disruptive evacuation and incident. So I just want to rattle very quickly through a few of the recommendations relating to people, relating to these issues, that I'm desperate on behalf of the residents I represented then and the residents I represent now in Brighton Pavilion, where we have a huge number of medium and high-rise blocks that need work, where I am, for no good reason, still seeing so many of these issues emerging in relation to the treatment of residents in blocks, the information they can get out of their landlords, the slowness of the action, the fact that substandard work is still being done on so many people's blocks. I just shouldn't still be here doing this so much after that. So I just want to start on the recommendations related to management. The way that the TMO treated its residents was abysmal. We've seen so much of the evidence about this, but the report really gets to the heart of it, where it says, however irritating and inconvenient it may be to deal with these residents, for the TMO to have allowed the relationship to deteriorate to such an extent reflects a serious failure on its part to observe its basic responsibilities. The Housing Ombudsman's echoed this, talking about gross imbalances of power. But residents who ask questions or who start to organise their neighbours to have some kind of collective voice that might get things done are still talked about as troublemakers, as militants, as a nuisance. I'm still encouraged not to listen to these residents when there are issues, and this is not correct. The other issue I want to focus on today is transparency of information. These are just like the basic building blocks on which resident trust can possibly be built. In 2017, I was having trouble getting the fire risk assessments from Camden Council, so I went to the Information Commissioner, and she responded in a fantastic way. She was clear that councils needed to publish these proactively, and yet here I am now representing residents in Brighton, and it's taken 18 months because my predecessor, Caroline Lucas, first asked the council to publish their fire risk assessments when she realised they weren't complying with the ICO's recommendations. I wrote to them back in September about this when I realised this was the case. Then finally last week I was told some assessments would be published imminently. Now this is just not good enough from councils, and I don't even know where to start with trying to get information about non-council landlords. It's been absolutely ridiculous on behalf of so many residents. So finally, the last thing I want to talk about was Civil Contingencies Act, and the recommendations there are tremendous as well, because the response on the ground, the humanitarian response, was nowhere near good enough.
Order. Thank
you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I associate my comments particularly with the Honourable Member for Kensington and Bayswater, but others too, and I very, very much welcome the Deputy Prime Minister's statement, written statement today, and her speech highlighting why the government is acting and what it's doing. And we know this was a systemic failure over many generations across many parts of government, and in fact it was late James Brokenshire as Minister that in 2018 issued a ministerial direction to civil servants to make sure that original money was spent to remove the most dangerous cladding. And I spoke to the senior civil servant who'd had to go back and speak to predecessors about what had gone wrong, and no one had seen this coming. So if I say to the Deputy Prime Minister there is a bigger lesson in this, it is about how government manages risk and watches for the unintended consequences of actions, because nobody, even with all of the problems, intended that this would happen. But this is what can happen if we don't keep our eye on the ball. So I hope she will take that back to the heart of government. But the impact in my constituency in Hackney South and Shoreditch has been immense. Hackney as a borough has the second largest number of unsafe buildings in London, with the London Fire Brigade showing that 93 buildings in Hackney are at high risk, a larger figure than all other London boroughs except for Tower Hamlets, as we've heard from two of my colleagues for Poplar and Canning Town and Stratford and Bow. And so we have 72 buildings that are over 18 metres tall, and together Hackney and Tower Hamlets, so the heart of East London, account for almost a quarter of the buildings with fire safety failures in London. And I do invite the Minister to come and meet with us, anyone in any of our constituencies, or indeed just in this place, to talk about what can be done across East London, because the impact is terrible. The insurance premiums have gone up massively, and many of my constituents who are leaseholders are facing bankruptcy. Even with this mission to achieve the change by 2029, that will be too late for some. And there are disruption to their lives, unable to move home and having families on hold, their lives on hold while they wait for this to be resolved. And I concur with the points made by my honourable friend, the member for Chelsea and Fulham, about housing associations, but in the interest of time I won't repeat them. And some of these properties are owned offshore or have opaque ownership, and that is one of the reasons that James Brokenshire, as the Minister, issued the ministerial direction, because he realised that one of the buildings with the worst cladding had 89 owners since it was built. So if there's one thing this government can do, it can stop our homes becoming financial vehicles for offshore finance measures. But 2029 is a challenge, and the National Audit Office report has been cited, says it is not on track until 2035 that we will see these changes. And with the construction industry and the state it's in and all the other pressures that this government trying to invest in infrastructure is going to see, I would love to hear from the Minister how we're going to make sure that we have the right construction skills in this country, and if it takes it, that the government will allow migration in order to make sure we've got the right skilled people in place. And finally, Madam Deputy Speaker, I want to highlight a wider issue about how we support families affected by fire. Back on the 5th of June of this year, during the election campaign on the Pembrey estate at Dalston-Lane, there was a fire that gutted a building with 36 households escaping with just their clothes off their back. 10 are still in temporary accommodation. Peabody Housing Trust did a good job in those early days getting them home housed, but many are still now living in hotel rooms. I've got someone who's in her 90s who is being trying to be offered a place by a estate agent. And I would like to see launch a campaign, if I may, today, Madam Deputy Speaker, if any other members would like to join me, to have a requirement for landlords to have a wider set of plans to help tenants in the aftermath of a fire or other crisis. Because, yes, there's the immediate challenge. Happily, in Dalston Lane, there were no fatalities, but the ongoing impact for those residents is immense. The mental health challenges, the disruption to their lives and the trauma, and we need a holistic approach to supporting tenants and residents in these situations. And every landlord should be required to have that model.
Luke Taylor.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. I'd also like to associate myself with the remarks of the Deputy Prime Minister, who did well to capture the tragedy that we all experienced so many years ago. The tragedy of Grenfell Tower will forever remain in our collective memory. On the devastating night of June the 14th, 2017, 72 lives were lost and many more impacted forever. The events of that night left a deep wound on London's history, physically and mentally. I take the opportunity to extend my deepest sympathies to their victims, the families, and all of those affected. The fire changed their lives in unimaginable ways. 7 years on, justice for the victims is painfully overdue. Yet today, thousands in the UK still live in buildings wrapped in dangerous, flammable cladding. Of the nearly 5,000 buildings identified as having dangerous cladding, less than half have work begun, and only a third have completed it. This means that there are between 4,000 and 7,000 buildings still unidentified, highlighting the absolute failure of the last government to get a grip on this crisis. This failure leaves an alarming number of buildings and residents still at risk. Just days before the publication of the final report in August, a fire broke out at a tower block in Dagenham. Thankfully, there were no fatalities, but over 200 firefighters battled flames that spread rapidly due to non-compliant cladding. These unsafe buildings are ticking time bombs. Residents in London live in constant fear of another disaster. Across London, including in my constituency of Sutton-Cheam, tower blocks still possess non-compliant cladding, which could pose serious risks to residents. The previous government mandated that local authorities must make these buildings safe. However, crucially, they provided no funding to support this at a time when local authorities were already facing severe underfunding. As a result, millions of pounds were added to council housing revenue accounts as an unplanned financial burden. Worse, government assistance through various schemes was exclusively directed towards leaseholders, leaving local authorities and tenants without support. While I welcome this new government's commitment to the replacement of all flammable cladding by 2029, urgency is of the utmost importance. It is essential that all dangerous cladding is removed as soon as possible, and that leaseholders should not be required to pay a penny towards these necessary safety improvements. This work is happening due to the failure of builders, product manufacturers and regulators to ensure that the buildings that residents lived in were safe. The report is utterly damning in the failures of the industry and criminal negligence as a result of the hidden safety tests that were failed and contrivance for profiteering instead of resident safety. We must all work to ensure that the mistakes of the past are never repeated. Another Grenfell must never happen. This tragedy will always serve as a stark reminder of the devastating consequence of neglecting safety and justice for local authority residents. Justice for the victims of Grenfell means a commitment to immediate action to implement the 58 recommendations of the Phase 2 report, not just for them, but for every community still at risk.
Dawn Butler.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. In the short period of time that I have, I want to just say to the survivors and the next of kin, some who are here today, some will be watching from home, that I'm sorry they have been so severely let down by the previous government, by their council. I do hope that the words of the Deputy Prime Minister today has given some comfort. Madam Deputy Speaker, Brent East is just next door, and we watched the fire unfold, and they say that 72 people died, but reality is we don't really know the exact number, as people from Kensington tell me. And we have to be honest, every time we say this disaster was preventable, we have to be honest, what happened in the system? 85% of people were black and a minoritized group. That is why they were not listened to. That is why they were ignored. And Grenfell United, Grenfell Next of Kin, they've been fighting for over 7.5 years. And as my honourable friend from Kensington and Bayswater said, they are still not being listened to. They have been so badly let down, and there needs to be an investigation to what happened, how the council used Grenfell to get in funds and what happened to those funds. There's so much that needs to be discussed. I also noticed, Madam Deputy Speaker, that Kwajo's here, housing campaigner and activist as well. This is an indication of how much people of colour are not listened to when they try to say that there is an injustice. And why was the cladding put on the building? The residents didn't want it. It was so that it looked pretty and nice to the more wealthy residents down the road. We've heard about the profits, the greed, the deregulation, that has caused this catastrophe. So if we want this not to happen again, we have to be honest, the reason why it happened in the first place. And my thoughts are with the bereaved families and the survivors. Every year when we go in the silent march, I remember speaking to a little girl that's got a little bit older now, and she said she was studying for her GCSEs, and the day after she went, she passed her GCSEs, and that's what she was focused on. But now what are they focusing on? Justice. And they haven't got justice. And until they've got justice, Madam Deputy Speaker, none of us should rest. None of us should feel comfortable that this may well happen again, because justice delayed is justice denied. And I pass Grenfell on my way home most nights, and every time I pass that building, I say a prayer for everybody who died, everybody who survived, and all the names that we will never know.
Thank you. I call Sarah Hall.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. On the 14th of June 2017, the country watched in horror as images of the fire engulfing Grenfell Tower emerged. I sat with a pit in my stomach as the true scale of devastation and loss of life became apparent. This tragedy should never have happened, and I will call it out for what it is: a national scandal. I hope the family, friends and community affected by the fire can find some peace in the fight for justice. But as I stand here today, I'm reminded of another disaster, the Summerland fire in 1973. Built with combustible cladding, critical matters of safety of life ignored and disregarded, and a catalogue of failures. 50 people died in that fire, including 11 children, and many more were injured. 44 years apart, but the parallels are all too clear. Speaking in 2013, a photographer called Noel Howarth, who captured pictures of the fire as it engulfed the leisure complex, said, "Unless we learn from history, we will repeat the mistakes we made in history." Whether it's 2017 or 1973, justice must be served and lessons must be learned. Both campaigns for justice have my full support.
Brian Leishman.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Now, I might only be 5 months in as an MP, but I've heard every government promise to cut red tape. But the thing is, regulations keep people safe in their homes and in the workplace. And Madam Deputy Speaker, on Grenfell, there are people and organisations that should have faced a trial by now. The criminal process should have happened simultaneously with the inquiry. There is plenty of evidence, plenty of proof, but the survivors of Grenfell are still waiting for action and justice. And when we look at Orgreave, Hillsborough, Infected Blood, Waspy Women, Horizon, Grenfell, the list of injustices that impact working class communities go on and on. Now, these are shared struggles, because Grenfell isn't about cladding. Grenfell is about how the state has repeatedly treated the working class with utter disdain and contempt. In reality, there has been so far a lack of urgency around implementing life-saving changes. This inquiry must change things. Time is of the essence, because how many Lakenall House or Grenfell Towers must there be before things really do change? We can all talk in sombre tones in this chamber, but why are people still going to their beds surrounded by flammable cladding tonight? Madam Deputy Speaker, Grenfell survivors deserve justice, and firefighters and every community across this country deserve a properly funded fire service to have the equipment they need to save lives and keep themselves as safe as possible. For example, firefighters deserve proper decontamination units to reduce their risk of getting cancer while at call-outs. And funding, rules and regulations do save lives. Our fire service and our working class communities across this country need invested in, not stripped bare, hollowed out and failed by the state.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and thank you to the Deputy Prime Minister for her statement here today. I want to put on record my deepest sympathies to all of those families affected by this terrible tragedy, and thank members from across this House for their thoughtful contribution to this debate. In particular, my right honourable friend for Kensington and Bayswater, and my honourable friend from Vauxhall and Camberwell Green for really emotive and powerful speeches. Group Commander Rod Wainwright served for 26 years. He had a distinguished career of service within the London Fire Brigade. He said, "I was not on duty that night, the 14th of June 2017. The Fire Brigade did not have the correct team on duty and called me to assist with the incident, but never recalled the correct team or number of staff required to be effective from Gloucester. That team should never have been outside of the M25, leaving London unprotected. I was called around 1 a.m. I spent 15 hours on the scene and was never relieved or given the assistance that was required. I had counselling from LFB counsellors on 3 different occasions, but it wasn't effective. I asked for specific PTSD counselling from a specialist and for the brigade to pay. They said no and to use the in-house option again. The specialist would have cost around £2,000, but I was told by the director that it wasn't suitable and it sent the wrong message. I was diagnosed with complex PTSD and subsequently medically retired, with no recognition, no thanks and no acknowledgement from senior management. As I said to this House before, Rod blames himself for not saving more people that night. However, in my view, he too is a victim of failure. And I will say again, it is people like us in this room, in his suits, who are to blame for the tragedy of Grenfell, not people, not heroes like Rod Wainwright. The Executive Summary to the Phase 2 report makes this clear, Madam Speaker. In fact, it should make grim reading to all of us. It describes the systematic dishonesty of those who made and sold the range screen cladding panels and insulation products, allowing customers to continue to buy products in the UK despite knowledge gained from fires in Dubai in 2012 and 2013. I repeat, systematic dishonesty. I'll briefly, and I'll apologise to the member for Broxbourne as I mentioned this because it was in his constituency, but in one of my other early MP surgeries I was visited by Claire Newman, who told me of her story about her mother, Daphne Holloway, and her neighbour, Ivy Spriggs, who died in their beds during a nursing home fire around the same time as the Grenfell disaster. The nursing home had no sprinkler systems. I welcome the commitment from the Deputy Prime Minister that all new care homes will be given sprinkler systems. But I would ask some consideration, as Claire is asking for sprinklers to be looked at to be put in retrospectively. I'd also ask that care homes, although they don't meet the 18-metre requirement, should be included on the higher risk register. Madam Deputy Speaker, on that terrible morning in 2017, 72 people died in their homes. Families were broken. Lives were destroyed. Let us please learn lessons from that tragedy.
Emily Darlington.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I draw the House's attention to the Register of Member Interests. I want to thank, first of all, the Deputy Prime Minister and the member for Kensington and Bayswater, plus all host of London MPs who have absolutely brought home what Grenfell meant in their constituencies. But the consequences of Grenfell are also being felt right across the country, and it's gone on for far too long for the residents of my constituency of Milton Keynes Central. Had the previous government proceeded at the pace with a confidence to take on developers with legal obligations and severe penalties, my residents would not still be living stuck in buildings that hadn't had the remediation required. Each year since Grenfell has left thousands of people in Milton Keynes worse off, impacting their financial and mental health. A woman in my constituency, we'll call her Angie, bought her flat with her husband in order to downsize, be mortgage-free and financially secure in their retirement. Unfortunately, she lost her husband, and her single pension cannot afford the 600% increase in insurance costs that she's seen in the last 7 years. She's accumulating debt that she will never be able to pay, and she cannot sell her flat to prevent further debt. Her plan for a secure retirement has turned into a nightmare that she can't get out of. And this is why I welcome the government's announcement today to challenge this practice by the insurance industry and promise to act if the insurance industry does not. Can I ask the Deputy Minister if she's had discussions with the industry about any retrospective reductions for those that have been affected by those huge insurance hikes? And while the Grenfell report rightly identifies the Royal Borough of Kensington and Chelsea for its many failings, not all local authorities were slow to respond to this, including my own in Milton Keynes Central, where 2 tower blocks of council housing were dealt with within a year of the tragedy, well within the guidelines that the government recommended, with no financial support from the government. So I would welcome the Deputy Prime Minister's views on whether those councils that took action at a huge cost to their HRA will be rewarded for their proactive attention by helping them to build more council homes. And I welcome the government's commitment to put local authorities at the heart of the solution. But there are still developments being put forward that may not meet building control requirements, especially permitted development of office conversions to flats. Currently, that's not a material consideration, so local planning committees have no choice but to pass it. Will she review the planning rules so that no building, new or converted, is unsafe for its residents? And would she also consider that building control should be fully in the hands of local authorities, where there can be no more developers using their favourite private building control to sign off developments? The role of the privatised BRE and its role in ensuring new materials has been brought up by many. Would the Minister consider renationalising the BRE so that there can be no doubt of any company influence over the safety of new building products? And finally, it is not just tall buildings that have been affected by this. For far too long, Those in buildings like Bacchus Lodge in my constituency has been rated a B2 under the EWS1 framework since March 22nd. Sorry, apologies.
I call the final contribution from the backbenches, John Slinger.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I strongly welcome the Deputy Prime Minister's statement, which shows that she both cares and is resolute in seeking redress. Given that the essence of how our country is run regarding public safety is at stake, I hope that my right honourable friend and other honourable members agree that for public confidence and for the deterrent effect to grow, we must ensure not only that justice is not denied through being delayed, but also that justice in the form of individuals, organisations and companies being properly held to account happens at all. This is important because, as other honourable members have alluded to, in previous cases of egregious state and business failure, there hasn't been sufficient justice of this kind. We owe this to the Grenfell victims, to the survivors, and indeed to wider society.
I call the Shadow Minister, David Simmons.
Thank you very much indeed, Madam Deputy Speaker. It's been a very appropriately serious and wide-ranging debate this evening, and I would like to open with some thanks to many who've enabled it to be that, the excellent journalism of the BBC, who've ensured that not just the initial fire itself, but the inquiry, the lessons from that have remained at the forefront of public debate. The survivors, the supporters of Grenfell United, I know some are here tonight, but many others, who contributed both to the inquiry process, but also similarly to ensuring that this remained at the forefront of the public mind. And to Sir Martin Morbick, who chaired it, I know was the subject of some criticism when first appointed. But I think when we read this Phase 2 report and everything that's led up to it, we can see that it's a very serious piece of work that puts us in a position to be able to make good decisions about what needs to change as a result. And being our parliamentary duty to consider these most serious of matters, we need to ensure that we get it right, for the sake of survivors, for the families of victims, and for all the other people who've been spoken about in the chamber this evening, who live with the anxiety about their own personal safety and circumstances, but all the others with a stake in the system, who need to ensure that the legislation which has flowed since the tragedy itself, and also the actions which the new government will need to continue, are fit for purpose. And to that end, Madam Deputy Speaker, I confirm that we in the opposition will be supporting the government to implement the proportionate and necessary measures that are required to keep the public safe. It's been said by many members across the chamber, and we agree, that those who intentionally have cut corners on building safety need to be held to account. Whilst it has taken a long time, what we also see is really good evidence gathered during this inquiry process, which provides the Metropolitan Police and others who may be involved in that, including the Crown Prosecution Service, with the beginnings of the evidence base that they need to hold specific individuals to account through criminal charges and pursuing action against those developers and those contractors who we know now clearly and fraudulently cut corners on building safety for their own financial gain. And it's been said very clearly, we need to ensure also that those bigger businesses, the big corporates, who may have condoned that action, need to be excluded from profiting from future public sector procurement activity. Now, clearly now, there will be further lessons to learn from the inquiry, and I do pay tribute to a number of members who made very serious, very considered speeches on the matter. The member for Vauxhall and Camberwell Green talked about the rise of the tenant management organisation. And I think that's an example where there will be difficult questions for all parties, for all government departments to consider. We know that the purpose of the last Labour government in introducing arm's length management organisations was to create a mechanism by which additional funding could be put forward to enable a higher standard to be achieved in the host social housing sector. But I also know, and KCTMO is a good example of that it created an additional barrier of governance between the local authorities that were the freeholders in most cases of the properties in question and the tenants who in theory gained additional control through the creation of boards to oversee what happened in their buildings, But as we see spelt out very clearly in the Phase 2 report, that often failed to materialise in really effective governance, and often in mutual finger-pointing, with each thinking that somebody else was responsible for the critical fire safety issues. And those lessons about governance, however difficult they may be for all sides of this chamber, must not be glossed over. Now, it's clear, as has been set out, that the government intends to take robust action. And it is the contention from this side of the chamber that the government does have some solid foundations to build on. As the member for Hackney South and Shoreditch set out, James Brokenshire, then the minister since sadly deceased, set out swiftly after the fire once there was some initial information available about the causes of it. And that led to the £400 million funding that was made available to social housing providers and local authorities in 2018 to ensure the swift remediation of social housing settings that were those with the most high-risk cladding on the exterior. And that was followed with the legislation on fire safety in 2021, the 2022 Building Safety Act, and the 2023 Social Housing Regulation Act, each of which was designed as the process of inquiry was progressing and as other evidence came to light to ensure that we were addressing, as far as we could, those things which we were legally able to do at each of those stages. Firstly, on the basics of fire safety, moving on to the broader lessons emerging about building safety, and ensuring that social housing regulation in what is a diverse sector was fit for purpose. Of course.
I thank the honourable gentleman for giving way, and I just want to repeat and see if I can get a response this time on the point I made earlier about the fact that we knew at distant stages there were needed to be certain skilled people to carry out this remediation work, from surveyors to actually contracting. Looking back, does he regret that perhaps some of that effort wasn't put in to developing those skills earlier, so that constituents of ours who are still waiting for remediation could have perhaps had it done quicker?
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The honourable member is absolutely right to highlight that a lack of capacity has been a huge issue in the sector, and certainly those who have been interested in housing for a long time will know that the remediation of risks can be incredibly complex. The bison blocks that many of us will either have in our own constituencies or housing constituents built across London were supposedly made safe in the 1980s in response to particular gas safety risks, and we know that subsequently other structural risks have been emerging, and making sure that there are people with the detailed knowledge, the technical ability to address those risks effectively is critical. We welcome the plans which the government is setting out to accelerate the work that was underway to remove dangerous cladding, and we will be scrutinising and working with the government to ensure that that continues to progress. And given that the previous government had made available over £5.1 billion to remove unsafe cladding from those buildings that were identified as high and medium rise, and therefore most at risk given the inherent risk, I suppose, to residents from being on buildings where there were a much higher number of floors. We need to ensure that that work is completed. And it is a positive that, according to the government's figures, by July 2024, 98% of those high-rise buildings which had the most dangerous styles of cladding had either started or completed the work to remove them. But we know that this comes in the context of many other risks which our residents and our constituents will be concerned about, that we need to ensure are addressed effectively. And when we look back to previous debates about building safety, we know that, as a number of members have mentioned in their contributions tonight, we cannot simply focus on the issue of cladding and materials and set aside issues such as the effectiveness of fire stopping and fire doors, which have often come to light in inspections subsequent to Grenfell as being deficient in all manner of buildings. The debates between the technical experts about whether sprinklers or misters are the most appropriate means of fire suppression in different types of settings. The need to provide effective sources of water for the fire brigade, whether dry risers or wet risers are the most effective, and that is something which clearly varies from location to location. And issues around both access for rescuers, fire safety operatives, and also the ability of residents to escape, again which have been highlighted significantly. need to feature in our thinking about how we go forward. Because as a number of members have highlighted, including the member for Hammersmith and Fulham, the emergence of new risks, such as much larger numbers of lithium batteries driving electric bikes and things like that, that are being charged in residential premises, are now very much at the forefront of the thinking of our fire brigades, as they look not just at what are the historical risks, which we know about and can take some action to mitigate, but what are the emerging new risks which they need equipment and technology and capacity to ensure they can deal with, should they come across those in a context where there is a risk to life. And other members have highlighted the importance of dealing, especially for those constituents who may be not able to benefit from the funding already in place for social and council tenants, but who are leaseholders, sometimes leaseholders of investment properties, who find themselves with properties that are uninsurable, where there is great difficulty in getting a mortgage, and that the intention that people have to purchase those properties in order to be their homes or part of a pathway for their family to access the kind of size and quality of housing that they need, that those pathways are reopened and that people who are trapped by some of those issues see that addressed. So in all of these respects, Madam Deputy Speaker, we undertake as an opposition that we will support the government in ensuring that there are really effective measures in place for the future. It's important also to acknowledge that whilst much of the debate has focused on the role of the suppliers of products used in construction, we also need to ensure that our existing estates are safe and fit for purpose. And we know that local authorities, social housing providers, landlords have a multitude of legal obligations. But I'm also conscious, from my experience as a local authority councillor, that not all tenants, not all occupiers wish to engage with that process. I'm aware that the local authorities that serve my constituency do have to go to court from time to time to get access to properties simply to carry out safety checks that are their responsibility as a landlord, that are part of keeping the bigger building of which those individual homes are a part safe for the benefit of all of those residents. So we need to ensure that local authorities, social housing providers, landlords have effective tools so that the expectations we are setting for them can be carried out without compromising the safety of residents. And that means being able to get access expeditiously. And all of this, as the member for Harwich and North Essex set out, what I thought was a very thoughtful and considered contribution to the debate, is about having henceforth a more effective, more independent system for managing all of these risks. Madam Deputy Speaker, in the Phase 2 inquiry, when it was published, Councillor Elizabeth Campbell, who is now the leader of Kensington Chelsea Council, set out in a way that I think deserves credit her acceptance on behalf of her local authority, and it's clear to be the case that she was not in charge of housing prior to the Grenfell fire, although she was a serving member there. The acceptance of failure, the willingness to take responsibility, and the ownership of that improvement journey in response to the detailed recommendations that are set out in that Phase 2 inquiry. Now, clearly, this has now spanned two governments of different parties. We have a record which I think we can be broadly proud of passing those pieces of legislation, allocating those very substantial sums of money which have built the foundations in order to ensure that our public housing and our private housing in this country is safer for tenants and residents of the future. The baton has clearly now been handed over. It is now their job, the government's job, to ensure that everyone else in the system is doing their job to the highest standard and in accordance with the law. They can count on the fact that, as an opposition, we will continue to support them in the delivery of that, but also should expect to be held to account, because it's in the interest of everybody in this country to ensure that that is achieved. I'm concluding, Madam Deputy Speaker.
Order. That wasn't giving way. I call on Minister Alex Norris.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Madam Deputy Speaker, this has been an important debate on the findings and recommendations of the Grenfell Inquiry. As the inquiry's Phase 2 report and today's debate has made clear, fundamental change is needed to make our homes secure and safe both for now and in the future. And I said at a previous building safety debate a few weeks ago, you know, as other colleagues do, I reflect on where I was on that night 7.5 years ago. But as well as the poignancy of that moment, I think that having sat on the other side of this chamber, if we'd said today that we'd be where we are now, as little progress has been made now, I think we would have been exceptionally surprised and disappointed. Not enough progress has been made, and it behoves now the government of the day to move at much greater pace, to build on the inquiry's recommendations, to move at speed. The inquiry's findings on the causes of the tragedy tell us something about a building safety system that was fundamentally broken, one with baked-in deficiencies, one that went unchallenged by those in authorities across the piece, and the relentless dishonesty of individuals. But it also tells us about Britain as well, and about the country in which we live in. And the consequence was buildings with unsafe cladding, and the consequences was 72 people losing their lives, and that devastation for their families and their communities. And as the Prime Minister says, as my right honourable friend, the Deputy Prime Minister has said, on behalf of the British state, we apologise. We cannot say sorry enough. Now, we, as the government, as the Prime Minister has set out, are considering our response to the report and have committed to coming back within 6 months with our response to the recommendations, as well as giving Parliament the opportunity to debate it at that time and on an annual basis. This has been an important debate, I must say that from the bottom of my heart, in terms of shaping our government's response to it. So I have some points to make of my own, but I'm going to major on the points made by colleagues, because a lot of important either questions or comments have been made that I think need a reply at this stage. And it starts, of course, with my honourable friend, the member for Kensington and Bayswater, who really shaped the debate in both spirit and in content. I thought he spoke with purpose, but also I could detect quite a lot of anger as well. And, you know, I know that when I speak to the local community, whether it's bereaved people, whether it's the next of kin, whether it's survivors, whether it's the immediate community, how angry they are with how little progress that has been made, how tired they are of telling people like me their story and the pain that it causes to tell their story, to hear it again played out in our nation's parliament, and how angry it makes them that we can't say that this wouldn't happen again, and the shame this is for our country. The honourable gentleman talked about the merry-go-round of blame. Well, let me tell him that this opportunity, this response to the recommendations is a chance for a single response, owned singly by the government of the day, to break that merry-go-round. The chair of the Select Committee, my honourable friend, the member for Vauxhall and Camberwell Green, again spoke with characteristic power. But what I took from her contribution, and I suspect will be the work of the Select Committee, is around more systematic action. And again, we've said that we will be addressing the recommendations in the timeline we've committed, but that we understand that there are systematic challenges within the building safety industry that have been highlighted by this report, yes, but also by the Moral Day report, by the Hackett Review, all of which we will pick up as part of that process, because the whole system needs reform, which takes me to what the honourable gentleman, the member for Harwich and North Essex, said around some very thoughtful ideas that he's coming to see me in the next few days around safety investigations that's worked in other industries. And again, we as a government are all ears in those regards. Now, both the member for Kensington and Basingstoke and Vauxhall and Camberwell Green talked about manufacturers. And again, as my right honourable friend has said, we have made commitments, the Prime Minister has committed, that we will take action against culpable manufacturers. As the first step in that process, the Cabinet Office has written to organisations named in the inquiry who bear different responsibilities for these failings. For those found by the inquiry to have been part of these horrific failings, this is the first step in stopping them being awarded government contracts. And as my right honourable friend says, the government intends to publish guidance to support the first set of decisions early in the next year to stop those most egregious companies getting government contracts. Now, a number of colleagues mentioned issues relating to leaseholders. So starting firstly with leaseholder protections. Leaseholder protections came into force on the 28th of June 2022. Qualifying leaseholders are protected from the costs of legal or other professional services relating to the liability or potential liability incurred as a result of a relevant defect. The Building Safety Act also provides for remediation contribution orders that allow interested persons to apply to the first tier tribunal for an order requiring building owners to pay to fix unsafe buildings. But I am struck as Minister how often colleagues come and tell me that these things aren't happening. I think particularly, though he's not in his place, the member for Leicester South regarding Abbey House, which I'll be very keen to talk to him about, but also my honourable friend, the member for Stratford and Bow. And again, I will meet with her to understand how that is manifesting for her constituents. The members for Southampton, Itchen, Hackney South and Shoreditch and Milton Keynes Central all talked about insurance for leaseholders. And again, it is impossible not to be struck by the financial and emotional impact that high insurance premiums are having on leaseholders. Affected leaseholders have been burdened with paying high premiums for too long. And as part of the remediation acceleration plan, we've announced that we will work with insurers to consider whether, for the duration of remediation programmes, government might support industry to reduce fire-related liabilities in order to reduce the high insurance bills leaseholders are facing. We've also launched today a public consultation on our plans to prevent excessive building insurance commissions for landlords, for property managing agents or for freeholders being charged to leaseholders. Our intention is to replace these with a fair and transparent fee. I've mentioned qualifying leaseholders, which I think takes me to the point of qualifying and non-qualifying leaseholders that the Honourable Member for Wells and Mendip Hills has raised in this debate and earlier during oral questions. Now, the Honourable Member invites me to set out a path of logic for the distinction between qualifying and non-qualifying leaseholders. Now, I would maintain that, in principle, setting a difference between what you would consider an ordinary resident and what you would consider perhaps a business owning perhaps very many properties, that is a distinction that you would want to draw in terms of providing public relief. But at some point you have to draw a line. And now the Honourable Lady, I thought, spoke with great eloquence about how that has manifest for married couples. And I know from my conversations with many others that there are similar edge cases, and we will look at those edge cases. I'm very keen to meet with the Honourable Lady because she spoke with great power on it about clearly one such case in her community. I also, with your forbearance, Madam Deputy Speaker, want to correct what I said slightly during orals earlier, because it is an important distinction. Because I talked about the need to find the balance between those who built the building and those who live in it. But actually the reality is the balance we need to find is with those who have financial interest in a building and those who live in it. And that is slightly different. I'll correct the record formally, but I didn't want to miss the first public opportunity to do so, given the importance of the point that was raised. Turning to justice, and again, this was a point made by honourable friends from Hammersmith and Chiswick, Warrington South, Alloa and Grangemouth. And again, it is impossible, speaking to bereaved, speaking to survivors, speaking to next of kin, speaking to the immediate community, it's impossible not to be struck by their anger and their entirely natural need for justice. And I have to say, to some degree, this is the element of this entire piece that I find most challenging as Building Safety Minister, because quite rightly, the police and courts are independent of government. We of course speak with the authorities, and I know they very clearly hear from those affected of the need for pace. They have said, the Metropolitan Police have said, it will take time, and that is one of the largest and most legally complex investigations they've ever conducted, and that they have 180 officers and staff dedicated to the investigation. An issue was raised also on court capacity, and honourable colleagues will know that that is something that is of great importance to the government today, and we're working very hard to relieve pressures facing the Crown Court, because that should not be a point at which this gets that justice is prevented. I haven't sketched down who did, but an honourable colleague has asked us about the memorial and the tower, and I wanted to be very clear on the record, because I think this is really important. But no decision has been made yet about the future of the tower. That is something that's being led by the Deputy Prime Minister, and she recognises and has expressed the importance of listening to the community on this sensitive issue, and she is actively doing so. And I think it's right that that is a conversation that at the heart has bereaved, has the survivors, has the next of kin, has the immediate community, and that is part of a process, and that I think there is unanimity across all involved and all in this place around a fitting and lasting memorial. And we salute the important work undertaken by the independent Grenfell Tower Memorial Commission, and we will support that in any way that we can. Colleagues, particularly from Chelsea and Fulham, also from Brighton Pavilion and Brent East, mentioned the role of local authorities. And the Council has admitted, as the Shadow Minister says, that it has failed in some of its most basic duties to keep residents safe, to listen to and act upon their concerns, and to respond effectively when disaster struck. We will, as central government, work very closely with them and with the community to hold the Council to the commitments that is made to improve its services for residents. I'm going to see the Leader shortly with a number of issues that residents have asked me to raise, and we will work very closely. And I think the spirit from both contributions to the Honourable Member for Brighton Pavilion and Brent East of the importance of transparency. Now, that's always important in local government, but if you want to build trust after a tragedy like this that laid bare so badly the failings in authority, transparency is such a crucial step in that. In that spirit, my honourable friend, the member for Harlow, talked about Rod Wainwright and the very brave firefighter on duty that night, and it was an exceptionally powerful contribution by my honourable friend, and that the actions of the London Fire Brigade, of course, has been subject to the independent inspector. That's very important. But again, I would give my commitment that we as a government, we have the Fire Minister sat next to me here, are responsible for the overall oversight of fire and rescue services and ensuring public safety more broadly. And we will work with the HMI, with the Mayor of London, with LFB to support the Brigade's continued progress. My honourable friend, the member for Hackney South and Shoreditch, talked about skills. And I do think that clearly 7 years on we have missed an opportunity. This ought to be a good industry for young people to want to go into. These are jobs that are needed. These are skilled work. This would be well-paid work and important work. What we're doing now as the government of the day is working closely with the Industry Competence Committee, first of all, to make sure that we've got a competent house-building workforce that can deliver safe and high-quality homes, which is especially important in light of our commitment to build 1.5 million homes over the life of this Parliament. In the autumn, the government launched Skills England, which will work closely with employers and other key partners to identify and address priority skills gaps, including in construction. More money was made available for further education, including construction, at the autumn budget, £300 million. I also had a similar conversation today with mayoral combined authorities and elected mayors about how they can use their locus on skills to promote this industry. But the Honourable Lady asked particularly about whether we would be willing to lean on the shortage occupation list if needs be. That wouldn't be, of course, the preference of the government of the day, but is a commitment that has been made. I want to use the time remaining, Madam Deputy Speaker, just to talk about the remediation acceleration plan, because a number of colleagues have talked about the importance of quicker remediation. I'm grateful to the opposition for their warm sentiment regarding it, and similarly for the Select Committee, but I am very clear, and clear for those who are watching, that the success is never in the publication of the plan. We expect, as the Honourable Gentleman says, to be held to account to the commitments that we've made today, and the member for Dewsbury and Batley talked about need to be quicker, and again, 2029 is not the date it starts, that is the date it will be resolved on. But our commitments today, for the record, by the end of 2029, all residential buildings 18 metres and over with unsafe cladding in a government-funded scheme will have been remediated. And by the end of 2029, every residential building 11 metres and over with unsafe cladding will either have been remediated, have a date for completion, or the landlords will be liable for severe penalties. And in doing so, our plan that sits behind this has 3 objectives. First of all, fix buildings faster, and I'm pleased to have secured that we as a government have secured a really important commitment from developers to accelerate their pace. That is an important part of it. Crucially, to identify all buildings with unsafe cladding. Again, if we talk to ourselves 7.5 years ago and said, well, in 7.5 years' time, we won't be able to say how many buildings there are with unsafe cladding, and that we'll be able to, that the best range that I can tell the House is somewhere between 4,000 and 7,000, speaks to the point made by the member for Sutton and Cheam. Clearly, that is not good enough. And finally, to support residents. So, in terms of acceleration, our plan has set a clear timeline, as I said, and we'll actively pursue the landlords of buildings that refuse to act. We'll ensure better cooperation between our regulators, which is something that comes up. I'm working hard with the Metro mayors to provide localised plans, because often the buildings that we're talking about are in their combined authority area, to work in partnership. In terms of identification, we've set up our own tellers tool through the cladding safety scheme, so residents can tell us directly. But we are working very hard and going through the ordnance survey maps and all bits of line-by-line work needed to do to assess 175,000 building records by April, over 540,000 in total, to make sure that actually we found all these buildings, we found out which ones have cladding defects, and those actions and remediations are taking place. And I know there is a lot of interest about protections for residents. I've talked a little bit about this, but particularly what I've been able to say on insurance today, I hope is welcome, and we look forward to making good on that. But if the market won't deliver, we will work closely with them to change that. And again, as I said, on commissioning. I think at that point I will draw my remarks to a close, Madam Deputy Speaker, because today's debate has been a very important one, but it has highlighted just how far we have to go, and the inquiry shows us that. Thousands of buildings still with unsafe cladding, that actually we need a complete reversal if we're going to put people and safety first ahead of profits, if we're going to empower residents, and if we're going to hold responsible those who are responsible for the safety crisis. We've committed to building 1.5 million homes in this Parliament that our country so desperately needs, but they must be safe and secure homes. They must be decent homes. And there's a package of measures we've set out today through the Remediation Acceleration Plan, which will help as the step in that. There are plans we've put in place, such as my honourable friend says, around residential PEEPs that will improve the fire safety and evacuation of vulnerable people in high-rise and higher-risk buildings. I've not really had the time to talk about the replacement of Waking Watch, but again, we're extending the Waking Watch Replacement Fund so that leaseholders can access that and get an alarm in place. And we do this at all times with those 72 lives held at the heart and in our hearts. Failed by the system at all points. Failed by this country to all degrees. We are so sorry for what's happened. But I know that those people have heard those sorries and heard those words from people like me too often. There is only one thing that we can do now to make that as best as it can be, and that is to deliver. The inquiry has helped us on our way there. Our plans are developing too. I'm grateful for the contributions colleagues are making. Now we must deliver. Thank you.
Yeah. The question is that this House has considered the Grenfell Tower Inquiry Phase 2 report. As many as are of that opinion say aye. Aye. Of the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it.